There are few sights in the grim annals of the 42nd millennium more terrifying than the Great Rift itself, that wound across the galaxy's heart, that bleeds raw chaos into real space. For 3 years since Guilliman's return, the Imperium had learned to endure its presence, to fight around its madness, to accept that half their realm lay shrouded in perpetual nightmare. Yet even the most hardened strategists of the High Lords had not imagined what would happen when the rift began to grow. The first signs appeared in the Vigilus sector, where warp storms that had raged for decades suddenly doubled in size. Astropaths across 3 systems screamed in unison before their minds shattered, their final messages speaking of something vast stirring in the deep warp. Navigator houses reported that the Astronomicon itself flickered, not dimming but twisting, as if the Emperor's light were being refracted through some immense prism of malevolence. On Terra, within the hallowed halls of the Imperial Palace, Trajan Valoris felt the tremor before any mortal instrument could detect it. The Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes stood before the great armory of the 10,000, his aureate armor gleaming in the sacred light, when the sensation struck him. Not a physical tremor, but something deeper. The throne itself seemed to shudder, and for one terrible moment, the golden light that had blazed constant for 10 millennia flickered. Across the galaxy, every faction's most sensitive seers felt the shift. On distant craft world Ulthwé, Eldrad Ulthran's eyes snapped open from meditation, and he saw a future that had never existed before. In the depths of Comera, Archon Vect paused in the midst of a political execution as the dark city's stolen suns pulsed with alien rhythm. Even Gazikul Thraka, leading his endless wah through the Octarius sector, felt the change as a deep rumble in his cybernetic skull, prompting him to bellow challenges at the stars themselves. The Great Rift was expanding. Within 72 hours, the impossible became undeniable. Warp storms erupted across sectors that had known relative peace since the Indomitus Crusade began. The Rift's tendrils reached toward Ultramar, toward Sacred Mars, toward the very heart of the Imperium. Worse still, reports flooded in from every corner of Imperial space. Tau expansion fleets were moving with unprecedented coordination. Tyrannid hive fleets that had been dormant suddenly surged with new purpose. Necron tomb worlds that had slumbered for eons crackled to life. The Orcs, always eager for a proper fight, seemed to be responding to some unheard call to war. High Admiral Spire stood before the hololithic displays in the fortress of Hera, watching red warning runes cascade across the galactic map like drops of blood. Each symbol represented not just a threat, but an existential crisis. The Astropath Prime beside him whispered readings that defied comprehension. Chaos incursions had tripled. Xenos aggression indices had reached levels not seen since the War of the Beast. Most disturbing of all, several loyalist systems had simply stopped responding to Vox communications. "How many sectors have gone dark?" Spire asked, though he dreaded the answer. 17 confirmed, my lord. Possibly 23, if we include the Kronos expanse. The aide's voice carried the weight of a man who had watched the galaxy burn before, but never quite like this. And the rift? Our best estimates suggest it will reach Terra within 6 months. 6 months. The number echoed in Spire's mind, like a funeral bell. In 6 months, the heart of the Imperium would be swallowed by the same madness that had claimed Cadia. Unless something changed, unless desperate measures were taken. The emergency conclave convened within hours. Lord Commander Guilliman himself, attended by Hololith from his flagship, the Macragge's Honor, where he fought a delaying action against a Chaos Armada that had materialized without warning. His noble features were drawn with exhaustion, but his voice remained steady as he addressed the assembled High Lords. "The time for conventional warfare has ended," Guilliman declared. "Every strategic doctrine, every tactical manual, every rule of engagement was written for a galaxy where we could afford to hold reserves in check. That galaxy no longer exists." Around the vast table, the most powerful figures in the Imperium absorbed his words. Grandmaster Voldus of the Grey Knights, attending in person rather than by projection, nodded grimly. Inquisitor Lord Torquemada's augmetic fingers drummed against the table's surface with mechanical precision. Captain General Valoris stood like a golden statue, but those who knew him recognized the subtle tension in his posture. "What do you propose, Lord Commander?" asked High Lord Fadix, his voice carefully neutral. Guilliman's image flickered as another wave of warp distortion washed across his position. When it stabilized, his expression had hardened further. "We deploy everything. The Grey Knights come out of the shadows. The Custodian Guard marches beyond Terra for the first time since the heresy. The Officio Assassinorum operates in the open. Every secret weapon, every hidden asset, every force we have held in reserve for the darkest hour." The silence that followed was profound. Several High Lords exchanged glances. To deploy the Adeptus Custodes en masse meant acknowledging that the Imperium faced extinction. To reveal the Grey Knight's existence meant abandoning 10,000 years of secrecy. To unleash the Assassin Temples meant crossing lines that had held since the Imperium's founding. "The precedent," began one of the lords. "Is irrelevant," Guilliman cut him off. "There is no precedent for this. The Great Rift grows stronger with each passing hour. Chaos pours through in numbers that dwarf the 13th Black Crusade. And if our intelligence is correct, we face not just chaos, but every major threat to humanity simultaneously. This is not a war we can win with half measures." As if summoned by his words, a new Vox transmission crackled through the chamber's communication array. The voice belonged to Watch Captain Artemis of the Death Watch, transmitted from the Jericho Reach. Priority Alpha transmission for the High Lords. We have confirmation. The Tyrannid presence in the Octarius sector has begun coordinated movement toward Imperial space. Estimated time to first contact with frontier worlds, 4 weeks. Additionally, Tau Empire forces have been observed employing technology previously unseen. Request immediate reinforcement or authorization for Exterminatus protocols. Another voice joined the chorus of doom, this one from the Armageddon sector. "This is General Kurov. Orc, whoa! Activity has increased by 600% across all fronts. We're not just fighting raids anymore. This is total war. They're using weapons that shouldn't exist, fighting with coordination that defies everything we know about greenskin psychology." The reports continued to flood in. From the eastern fringe, tales of Necron legions awakening with purpose rather than mere territoriality. From the galactic core, whispers of Eldari forces moving with desperate urgency, as if racing against some cosmic deadline. Guilliman's expression grew more grim with each transmission. When the reports finally ended, he looked directly at each High Lord in turn. "Do you see? This is not a crisis we can weather with standard protocols. Our enemies have abandoned restraint. They deploy their most terrible weapons without hesitation. If we continue to hold back, if we continue to protect our secrets while the galaxy burns, then we are complicit in our own destruction." The vote, when it came, was not unanimous, but it was decisive. By a margin of 8-4, the High Lords of Terra authorized the deployment of the Imperium's most guarded assets. Ancient seals would be broken. Oaths of secrecy would be set aside. Forces that had remained hidden since the dark days of the heresy would march under the light of burning stars. Yet even as the Imperium made its fateful choice, similar decisions echoed across the galaxy. In the darkest corners of the Eye of Terror, demon primarchs stirred from their eternal games to marshal forces unseen since the long war began. On distant tomb worlds, Necron overlords calculated the cost of deploying weapons that even they feared. In the void between galaxies, the Tyrannid hive mind pulsed with alien hunger, preparing to unveil adaptations 10,000 years in the making. The die was cast. Across 1,000,000 worlds, the most terrible secrets of each faction would soon be revealed. The age of hidden warfare was ending. What would rise from its ashes remained to be seen. But one truth echoed through the warp and real space alike. The galaxy would never be the same. In the deepest vaults of terror, where even the custodians rarely tread, ancient machinery that had slumbered since the age of strife began to hum with power. The Emperor's most terrible weapons, held in reserve against humanity's darkest hour, stirred to wakefulness. And somewhere in the labyrinthine depths of the Imperial Palace, a single golden tear traced down the desiccated cheek of the master of mankind, as if he too understood that the time for restraint had passed. The galaxy trembled. The war was about to begin in earnest, and for the first time in 10,000 years, every faction would fight without holding anything back. In the halls of the Imperial Palace, where silence had reigned for 10 millennia, the sound of marching feet echoed like thunder. Not the steady tread of mortal guards, but something deeper, more resonant. The footsteps of demigods preparing for war. Captain General Trajan Valoris stood before the throne of vigilance, his aureate armor gleaming in the sacred light that had never dimmed since the Emperor's internment. Around him, the Adeptus Custodes assembled as they had not done since the dark days of the Horus heresy. 10,000 warriors, each a match for 12 Astartes, each bearing weapons that had drunk the blood of traitor primarchs. The sight would have humbled kings and broken the minds of lesser mortals, but Valoris felt only the weight of necessity pressing upon his shoulders. "My lord," spoke Shield Captain Aquilus, his voice carrying the reverence due to both his commander and the moment they faced. "The last of the guard companies have reported ready. All 10,000 stand prepared to march." 10,000. The number carried weight beyond mere mathematics. For 10,000 years, the custodian guard had remained upon Terra, bound by ancient oaths and the sacred duty to protect the master of mankind. Even during the 13th Black Crusade, when Cadia burned and the galaxy teetered on the brink of absolute damnation, they had held to their posts. Only small shield companies had ventured beyond Terra's atmosphere, and never the full might of the Golden Legion. Yet the Great Rift's expansion had changed everything. The choice before them was not preservation of tradition, but preservation of humanity itself. Valoris turned to address the assembled host, his voice carrying across the vast chamber with the authority of ages. "My brothers, we stand at the threshold of an age unlike any that has come before. For 10 millennia, we have been Terra's guardians, the Emperor's chosen protectors. Today, we become something more. Today, we become his vengeance made manifest." The custodians stood in perfect formation, their guardian spears and sentinel blades catching the sacred light. Each warrior represented centuries of training, genetic enhancement that surpassed even the Space Marines, and devotion that bordered on the divine. They were, in every sense, the closest thing to the Emperor's own will given physical form. "The galaxy burns," Valoris continued, his words echoing in the sacred space. "Our enemies believe that distance from Terra grants them safety from our wrath. They will learn otherwise." The Golden Legion marches to war, not as protectors bound to a single world, but as destroyers unleashed upon those who would threaten our father's realm. Across the galaxy, other Imperial forces felt the tremors of this historic moment. In the hidden monasteries of Titan, shrouded in perpetual secrecy within the warp, the Grey Knights received their own unprecedented orders. Grandmaster Voldus stood before the Chamber of Purity, where the chapter's most sacred relics lay waiting. Around him, his brother warriors knelt in silent prayer, their psychically attuned minds touched by visions of the coming storm. The Grey Knights had fought in shadow for 10,000 years, their very existence known only to the highest echelons of the Inquisition and the chapter's own brotherhood. They were the Emperor's gift against demons, warriors whose souls burned so bright with faith that chaos itself recoiled from their presence. Yet their secrecy had always been their strength, their anonymity, a weapon as potent as their nemesis force weapons. "Brothers," Voldus spoke, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy and doom, "the time of shadows ends. By order of Lord Commander Guilliman and the High Lords of Terror, we step into the light. Let the galaxy see what the Emperor's fury truly looks like when it walks among men." The implications rippled through the Grey Knights like a psychic shockwave. To reveal themselves meant abandoning 10 millennia of careful concealment. Imperial Guard regiments that witnessed their actions had traditionally been mind-wiped or executed to preserve the secret of their existence. Space Marine chapters that fought beside them had their memories altered by inquisitorial psychers. The common people of the Imperium believed them to be myths, whispered legends told by shell-shocked survivors who could never quite remember the details of their salvation. No more. Brother Captain Stern felt the weight of revelation settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of stars. Grandmaster, the protocols, the memory purges, the executions of witnesses are ended, Voldus replied with finality. We fight now in the Emperor's light, not in his shadow. Let every Imperial citizen see that their faith has been rewarded with the greatest of his gifts. Let every enemy of mankind learn to fear not just our blades, but our very existence. Meanwhile, in the deepest vaults beneath the Himalaysian peaks, where even the custodians feared to tread without the proper rituals, the Officio Assassinorum stirred to unprecedented life. The Grand Master of Assassins, a figure so cloaked in mystery that even his name was a state secret, stood before hololithic displays showing target matrices that spanned the galaxy. For the first time in Imperial history, all 4 major temples would deploy simultaneously, not individual assassins sent on carefully planned missions, but entire cadres unleashed in coordinated strikes. The thought would have terrified the High Lords in any other age, but these were not ordinary times. Eversor Temple assassins, their bodies pumped full of combat stims and their minds conditioned beyond the point of individual identity, awaited deployment in stasis pods that hummed with barely contained violence. Kalidas operatives shed their current identities like snakes, shedding skin, preparing to become whoever the mission required. Vindicare marksmen calibrated rifles capable of making kills across impossible distances, their shots guided by prescience and mathematics in equal measure, and in the deepest vaults, Colexus assassins sat in their null chambers, their very presence a wound in reality that made even the most hardened inquisitors nauseous. The Grand Master's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the hidden complex through vox channels secured by technologies that predated the Age of Strife. By order of the Senatorum Imperialis, all temples are authorized for simultaneous deployment. Operation Purge Protocol is now active. Let the galaxy's enemies learn that the Emperor's justice has many faces, and all of them are death. Yet perhaps the most visible symbol of the Imperium's unleashed wrath would be Saint Celestine herself. The living saint had returned to the galaxy during the darkest hours of the 13th Black Crusade, her resurrection a beacon of hope when all seemed lost. Now, as she stood upon the bridge of the triumph of Sanguinius, her wings spread wide and her blade blazing with holy fire, she prepared to lead a crusade unlike any since the days of the Great Crusade itself. Around her flagship, the largest assemblage of Adepta Sororitas forces in Imperial history, formed into battle groups. Orders militant that had not fought together since the age of apostasy now sailed in formation, their battle hymns echoing across the void. The sight of 10,000 sisters of battle kneeling in prayer as their ships prepared for warp translation would have moved even the most cynical Imperial commander to tears. Celestine's voice, when she spoke to the assembled force, carried the authority of divine mandate. Sisters, we have served as the Emperor's faithful for millennia, content to guard shrines and protect the faithful. But faith without action is meaningless, and the time for action has come. Today, we do not merely defend the Emperor's faithful. Today, we become his wrath given form, his justice made manifest. The Vox channels crackled with responses from 100 different ships, 10,000 different voices raised in unison. His will be done. Across the galaxy, ordinary Imperial citizens began to witness sights that belonged in their most sacred stories rather than reality. On the hive world of Necromunda, where gang warfare had raged for centuries, golden giants descended from the sky like avatars of the Emperor himself. Their presence alone quelled violence that had seemed eternal, as even the most hardened criminals fell to their knees before the demigods of terror. On Armageddon, where orc raids had grown increasingly bold, the sky suddenly filled with silver angels whose very presence made the air itself sing with holy power. The Sisters of Battle had arrived not as garrison forces, but as an avenging host. Their drop pods fell like falling stars, each impact crater becoming a shrine to righteous fury. In the void between worlds, merchant captains and navy patrols reported sightings that defied explanation. Ships that registered on no sensor save the human eye, bearing warriors in Terminator armor whose very souls blazed with psychic fire. The Grey Knights had begun their work, and even the warp itself seemed to recoil from their presence. Yet perhaps most unsettling of all were the deaths that began to occur among the Imperium's enemies. Chaos cultists across a dozen systems died in their sleep, their faces locked in expressions of perfect terror. Tau commanders found their most secure bunkers compromised by killers who left no trace save the corpses of their targets. Orc war bosses, who had seemed invincible, suddenly choked on poison that appeared from nowhere, or died from sniper shots, fired from impossible distances. The Officio Assassinorum had begun to hunt in packs. Lord Commander Gilliman, observing the deployment from the strategium of the Macrage's honor, felt the weight of history settling upon his shoulders. He had authorized the deployment of forces that his father had intended as last resort weapons, trump cards to be played only when the Imperium faced absolute extinction. Yet as reports flooded in of their effectiveness, he wondered if perhaps they should have been unleashed long ago. "My lord," spoke Chief Librarian Tigurius, his psychic hood crackling with contained energy, "the tarot shows patterns I have never seen before. The Emperor's light burns brighter in the warp than it has for centuries. Our enemies, they are afraid." Gilliman nodded, his expression grim but satisfied. "Good. Fear is a weapon we haven't wielded properly for too long. Let them know that the Imperium is not merely a collection of worlds to be conquered, but the realm of a god-emperor, whose wrath has many faces. The Golden Legion marched. The Grey Knights emerged from shadow. The assassins hunted without restraint. The faithful raised their voices in songs of war. And across the galaxy, humanity's enemies began to understand that the true power of the Imperium had never been fully unleashed. Until now, the Emperor's wrath was abroad in the galaxy, and it wore 1,000 different faces. Each one promised the same thing: the complete and utter destruction of those who dared threaten mankind's survival. The war had truly begun. From the darkest depths of the Eye of Terror, where reality bent and screamed under the weight of pure chaos, came the sound that had haunted the dreams of tech priests for 10,000 years. Not the steady rhythm of blessed machinery, but the discordant symphony of technology perverted beyond recognition. The dark mechanicum was stirring, and with it, horrors that made a mockery of the Omnissiah's sacred teachings. On the Hellforge world of Zana II, where the sky raged with perpetual warp storms and the very ground pulsed with demonic energy, Magos Heretic Dracovac felt the call to war resonate through his corrupted vox implants. His form, once human, had long since abandoned any pretense of biological origin. Mechadendrites writhed around his torso like serpents of living metal, each one terminating in weapons that violated the fundamental laws of physics. Where his face had once been, a shifting mass of sensors and demon-possessed cogitators processed information from dimensions that sane minds could not comprehend. "The time of revelation has come," he spoke, his voice a harmony of mechanical precision and demonic whispers. "Too long have we labored in shadow, while the false Omnissiah's servants cling to their primitive superstitions. Today, we show the galaxy what true innovation looks like when unshackled from the chains of ignorance." Around him, the forges of Zana II roared to life with unholy purpose. These were not the sacred manufactoriums of Mars, where ancient traditions guided every gear and blessed every rivet. Here, demon-possessed machines spawned weapons that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Assembly lines, staffed by tech heretics and possessed servitors, produced ammunition that screamed as it flew, armor that fed on the fear of its enemies, and vehicles that ran not on Promethium, but on the suffering of the innocent. The greatest of these abominations were the demon engines, technological horrors that fused the mechanical precision of the Adeptus Mechanicus with the raw power of the warp. Defilers stalked through the smoky halls of the forge, their crab-like legs leaving molten footprints in the metal decking. Mauler fiends prowled the weapon-testing grounds, their magma cutters carving through reality itself as they hunted for prey. And in the deepest vaults, where even the tech heretics feared to tread alone, the soul grinders stirred to wakefulness, their cannon arms already beginning to charge with energies that belonged to no natural universe. Yet these were merely the vanguard. In the titanic manufacturing bays, where shadows danced with minds of their own, something far more terrible was taking shape. The Chaos Titans of the Dark Mechanicum bore little resemblance to their loyalist counterparts, where the Titans of the Collegia Titanica were weapons of war piloted by noble warriors. These were prison fortresses for greater demons whose power had been harnessed and weaponized. The Imperator-class Titan Blasphemous engine stood ready for deployment, its void shields crackling with warp energy that made nearby tech heretics weep tears of liquid mercury. Within its command throne, not a human princeps, but a bloodthirster of Khorne, raged against its mechanical bonds, its fury channeled into weapon systems that could level cities with a single volley. The machine's war horn, when it sounded, drove lesser demons to their knees and shattered the sanity of any mortal who heard it across 3 star systems. Similar preparations were underway across a dozen Hellforge worlds. On Galmech, the demon-possessed forges had been working for centuries to complete a project that defied comprehension. A space-borne weapons platform the size of a moon, its surface bristling with reality-rending cannons that fired shells of crystallized chaos energy. On Q-Sal, where the boundaries between the material universe and the warp had been erased entirely, tech heretics rode demon engines that existed as pure thought given mechanical form. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the emergence of technologies that should not have been possible even by the standards of the dark age of technology. Viral scrap code, programs written in binary cant, mixed with demonic languages, began spreading through Imperial communication networks like a plague of corrupted data. Tech priests across the galaxy suddenly found their sacred machines turning against them, their blessed cogitators sprouting demonic faces that spoke heresies in synthetic voices. On Mars itself, the heart of Imperial technology, Fabricator General Odia Raskian felt the tremors of corruption spreading through the planetary network. Ancient machines that had functioned perfectly for millennia suddenly developed minds of their own, their machine spirits revealed to be something far more malevolent than anyone had imagined. "Blessed Omnissiah preserve us," whispered Dominus Kelbor Hu 91, his augmetic voice crackling with interference that sounded disturbingly like laughter. "The corruption spreads faster than our purge protocols can contain it. 3 manufactoriums have gone dark in the last hour, and we're receiving reports of impossible geometries manifesting in the production lines." The scrap code was more than mere digital corruption. It was a virus that infected not just data, but reality itself, causing machines to develop capabilities that violated every known law of engineering. Laserguns began firing beams of pure hatred that bypassed physical armor to wound the soul. Chimera APCs sprouted additional turrets that existed in other dimensions, allowing them to fire around corners and through solid walls. Most disturbing of all, some servitors began to regain their human consciousness, only to discover that their mechanical bodies had been possessed by minor demons for decades. Yet the true scope of the Dark Mechanicum's power became apparent when Forge worlds that the Imperium had believed destroyed during the heresy suddenly appeared on long-range Auspex readings. These were not new conquests, but ancient bastions that had hidden themselves in pocket dimensions within the Eye of Terror, spending 10,000 years perfecting technologies that made the Imperium's most advanced weapons look like primitive clubs. The Forge world of Lucius, thought lost during the Scouring, materialized in the Cadian system with a fleet of vessels that defied every known principle of naval architecture. Their ships were living beings of metal and demon flesh, capable of regenerating damage by consuming the souls of their crews. Their weapons fired ammunition that existed in the past, present, and future simultaneously, making them impossible to dodge because they had already hit their targets before being fired. At the head of this technological nightmare rode beings that had once been among the greatest minds of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Demon Prince Kelbor Hall, the fallen Fabricator General of Mars, piloted a Titan that was simultaneously a war machine, a demon prince, and a dimensional gateway. His very presence on a battlefield caused Imperial technology to rebel against its operators, as the machine spirits recognized their true Dark Master. The implications of the Dark Mechanicum's emergence sent shockwaves through every level of Imperial command. On Luna, the Mechanicus biologist laboratories reported that their vat-grown servitors had begun exhibiting signs of demonic possession. On Terra, Ancient cogitator banks dating back to the Age of Strife suddenly activated, displaying scrolling text in languages that hurt the mind to read. Lord Commander Guilliman, receiving reports from across the galaxy, understood the magnitude of the threat they faced. This was not merely another enemy fleet to be defeated in honest battle, but a corruption that struck at the very foundation of Imperial civilization. Every lasgun, every vox caster, every data slate was potentially a weapon aimed at the heart of humanity. "How do we fight an enemy that can turn our own weapons against us?" asked Captain Sicarius, his scarred features grim as he studied the tactical displays. "Every piece of technology we rely on becomes a potential traitor." Guilliman's expression reflected the weight of command in an age where even the most basic tools of war could not be trusted. "We adapt. We remember that humanity conquered the stars long before we became dependent on machines. And we pray to the Emperor that our faith proves stronger than their corruption." Yet even as Imperial forces struggled to comprehend the scale of the technological threat, the Dark Mechanicum prepared to unveil its greatest horror. In the deepest forges of the Eye of Terror, where time flowed backward and mathematics rewrote themselves according to demonic whim, work had begun on a project that would make even the Death Star of ancient Terran fiction seem crude by comparison. The Omnissiah's Bane was not a single weapon, but an entire star system converted into a reality engine, capable of imposing the laws of the warp upon vast swaths of normal space. When activated, it would not merely destroy Imperial worlds, but transform them into extensions of the Eye of Terror itself, where the thoughts and fears of their populations would become literally real. The war of flesh and blood was horrific enough, but the war of spirits and souls that the Dark Mechanicum brought with it promised to be far worse. They did not merely seek to conquer the galaxy, they sought to transform it into something that would make the Eye of Terror look like a paradise by comparison. In the manufactoriums of loyalist Forge worlds, tech priests began the grim work of purging their own sacred machines, knowing that corruption could manifest without warning in even the most blessed cogitator. The age of technological innocence was ending, replaced by an era where every gear and circuit had to be watched for signs of damnation. The Dark Mechanicum had returned in force, and with them came the terrifying revelation that the machine spirits humanity had worshipped for millennia were not the benevolent entities they had believed them to be. In the grim darkness of the far future, even the sacred machinery of the Imperium could not be trusted. The war was no longer just between armies. It had become a battle for the very soul of technology itself. The greatest horror of the galaxy-wide crisis was not the demon armies pouring forth from the Eye of Terror, nor the ancient technologies of the Dark Mechanicum, risen to unleash mechanical nightmares. It was the realization that the enemy had been within the Imperium's borders all along, hidden among the faithful, wearing the faces of trusted allies and beloved leaders. On the industrial world of Mordian Prime, where the Iron Guard had stood as paragons of Imperial discipline for millennia, Colonel Voss received the coded transmission that changed everything. The Vox message was brief, encoded in the regimental cant that every officer knew by heart, yet its meaning sent a chill through his augmetic spine. After 40 years of loyal service, after leading his men through 3 major campaigns against the enemies of mankind, he was finally being called to serve his true masters. "All units, stand ready for Operation Crimson Dawn," he spoke into his command Vox, his voice carrying the same authority it had for decades. Around him, his staff officers nodded in acknowledgement, their faces bearing the same expressions of professional competence they had worn since their commissioning. None of them suspected that beneath their uniforms carved into flesh that had never known the Emperor's light, lay the 8-pointed star of chaos undivided. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out on 10,000 worlds. Planetary governors who had ruled justly for generations suddenly revealed allegiances that predated their very births. Regimental commanders who had bled for the Golden Throne ordered their troops to turn their weapons on loyalist forces. PDF officers who had defended their homeworlds with unwavering courage led their soldiers in uprisings that had been planned for decades. The Alpha Legion's greatest weapon was not their gene seed or their weapons, but their patience. For 10,000 years, they had seeded agents throughout the Imperium's infrastructure, not as conquerors but as sleepers, living entire lifetimes as loyal Imperial citizens while awaiting the call to reveal their true nature. Some had been born into their roles, raised by parents who themselves had served the twin Primarchs without ever knowing their true names. Others had been recruited as children, their memories carefully modified to believe they were orphans rescued by the Imperium rather than assets carefully placed for future use. On the shrine world of Ophelia 7, where the Ecclesiarchy's most sacred cathedrals pierced the sky like golden spears, the activation began not with violence, but with prayer. Cardinal Benedetto, who had led the planetary faithful in worship for 3 decades, stood before the altar of sacred martyrs as he had every morning for 30 years. Yet today, his prayers carried different words. "Blessed be the 4 powers who rule all destinies," he intoned, his voice carrying the same reverence it had always held. "Blessed be the truth that lies beneath the Emperor's lies. Blessed be the enlightenment that comes only through damnation." The congregation, composed of nobles and commoners who had worshipped together for generations, echoed his words with the same fervor they had once reserved for the Emperor's name. For they too had been waiting, generation after generation, for the moment when their true faith could be revealed. The scale of the revelation defied comprehension. Entire regiments of the Astra Militarum, formations that had served with distinction in the Indomitus Crusade itself, suddenly turned their weapons on their allied forces. PDF units that had defended their worlds against Orc invasions and Tyrannid incursions now opened fire on Imperial installations they had protected for decades. General Creed of Cadia's legacy, the tactical doctrine that had saved the Imperium countless times, was turned against itself as officers trained in its principles used their knowledge of Imperial strategy to orchestrate devastating betrayals. Supply lines that had fed loyalist forces for months suddenly began delivering poisoned rations and corrupted ammunition. Communication networks that had coordinated Imperial responses became instruments of disinformation, sending loyalist forces into carefully prepared ambushes. Yet perhaps most terrifying of all was the religious aspect of the uprising. Dark apostles, the black priests of chaos, who had hidden among the Imperium's clergy for centuries, revealed themselves across 1,000 cathedral worlds. Their sermons had always carried subtle corruption, their prayers had always contained hidden blasphemies, but they had been so skillfully woven into orthodox doctrine that even trained inquisitors had failed to detect them. On Necromunda, in the depths of the Underhive, where Imperial authority had never fully penetrated, entire cult armies emerged from hidden temples that had operated for generations. These were not the crude chaos cults that Imperial forces occasionally rooted out, but sophisticated religious organizations with their own hierarchies, their own trained militia, their own networks of support that reached into the highest levels of Hive city government. The redemptionist cults that had long troubled Necromunda's authorities revealed their true nature as front organizations for something far more sinister. Their fanatical devotion to purification through fire took on new meaning as they began burning not just criminals and mutants, but anyone who refused to acknowledge the supremacy of Khorne. Their leader, Cardinal Crimson, threw off the pretense of imperial faith and proclaimed himself a prophet of the blood god. For too long we have hidden our true devotion behind the mask of false piety, he thundered from the steps of the Spire's cathedral, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive structure. Today we cast aside deception and embrace our destiny as the chosen of chaos. The uprising was not random violence, but a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been planned for centuries. In the Segmentum Solar itself, PDF forces on 36 worlds simultaneously declared independence from Imperial authority. Their timing was perfect, coordinated through communication networks that bypassed Imperial monitoring through methods that predated the Imperium itself. On Mars, where the Omnissiah's faithful had tended the sacred machines for 10 millennia, tech priests who had served with apparent loyalty for centuries suddenly revealed the true nature of their modifications. Their augmetics were not mere improvements to human physiology, but gateways for demon possession. Ancient forges that had produced weapons for Imperial forces now disgorged armies of possessed servitors and demon engines. The revelation sent shockwaves through every level of Imperial command. If Mars itself could harbor such extensive corruption, what world could be trusted? If regiments that had fought alongside the Ultramarines could turn traitor, what force could be relied upon? Lord Commander Guilliman felt the weight of betrayal like a physical blow as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. These were not external enemies to be fought and defeated, but corruption that had grown within the Imperium's own body like a cancer. Every victory his forces had won, every campaign they had fought, had potentially been aided by the very enemies they now faced. "How extensive is the infiltration?" he asked Chief Librarian Tigurius, his normally composed features showing the strain of commanding an empire where loyalty itself had become suspect. Tigurius consulted data slates that contained intelligence gathered by the most trusted agents of the Inquisition, yet even these sources were now questionable. "My lord, our most conservative estimates suggest that at least 15% of Imperial forces have revealed themselves as traitors. The actual percentage may be significantly higher, as many units have simply ceased responding to communications rather than openly declaring for chaos." 15%. On some worlds the number was higher. On Mordia, nearly half the Iron Guard had joined the uprising. On Valhalla, entire ice fortresses had declared for the Dark Gods, their defenders revealing that their renowned stoicism had always been a mask for something far colder than mere discipline. Yet the true horror became apparent when the demons began to manifest. The massive uprisings, the countless acts of betrayal, the rivers of blood spilled by brother fighting brother, had created a psychic resonance that called to the warp like a beacon. Demon princes, greater demons, and lesser demons alike began to materialize in unprecedented numbers, drawn by the faith and devotion of mortals who had finally cast aside the pretense of imperial loyalty. The blood god Khorne sent his bloodthirsters to lead the most violent uprisings, their presence turning disciplined military coups into orgies of slaughter that consumed entire cities. Nurgle's great unclean ones manifested in plague-ridden hive cities, their blessings turning already dire conditions into apocalyptic hellscapes. Slaaneish's keepers of secrets appeared at the courts of corrupted nobles, their seductive presence turning political intrigue into decadent madness, and Tzeentch's lords of change whispered guidance to the cult's leaders, their impossible knowledge allowing even the smallest uprisings to achieve devastating results. On Katashan, where the jungle fighters had earned a reputation as the Imperium's most effective guerrilla forces, entire regiments melted into the deadly forests, taking their knowledge of Imperial tactics with them. Their expertise, gained through decades of fighting for the Emperor, now served the ruinous powers as they began a campaign of sabotage that crippled Imperial response efforts across 3 subsectors. The enemy within had revealed itself at last, and its reach was far greater than the most paranoid Inquisitor had ever imagined. Trusted allies had become bitter enemies overnight. Sacred worlds had become blasphemous strongholds. The very foundations of Imperial society had been revealed as compromised by corruption that ran deeper than anyone had dared to suspect. Yet perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that many of the traitors genuinely believed they were acting righteously. Generations of careful indoctrination had convinced them that the Emperor was a false god, that the Imperium was a tyrannical regime that oppressed humanity's true potential, that only through service to chaos could mankind achieve its destiny among the stars. The war was no longer just between different factions fighting for control of the galaxy. It had become a civil war within the Imperium itself, where brother fought brother, where every order had to be questioned and every loyalty verified. The enemy had not conquered the Imperium from without. They had been within it all along, waiting for their moment to strike. And when that moment came, they struck with the fury of the truly faithful, convinced that their betrayal was actually salvation. The lost and the damned had revealed themselves at last, and their numbers were beyond counting. In the depths of space, where tomb worlds had slumbered for 60 million years, something stirred that even the Necrons themselves feared. The Great Sleep had been meant to preserve their race until the galaxy was ready for their return. But the dreams that visited them in those ions of slumber had not been peaceful. Now, as ancient activation protocols triggered across a dozen sectors, the Masters of Death discovered that death itself had found a way to corrupt even their perfect mechanical forms. The first signs appeared on the tomb world of Drazak, where Overlord Trazin the Infinite maintained his vast collection of galactic curiosities. The awakening should have been orderly, systematic, each warrior rising according to protocols established before the birth of most stellar civilizations. Instead, the first Necrons to emerge from their stasis chambers came forth not with the cold precision of their kind, but with something that resembled hunger. They were flayed ones, their once perfect forms twisted into grotesque parodies of predators. Living metal had been reshaped by an infection that defied understanding, their fingers extended into claws, their jaws distended to accommodate rows of cutting teeth that served no purpose for beings who had not known hunger for millions of years. Yet they hungered nonetheless, driven by an insatiable need to strip flesh from bone, to wear the skins of their victims like the organic forms they had lost so long ago. Trazin watched in horror as warriors he had known for eons shambled through his galleries, their movements lacking the fluid grace of Necron engineering. They paused at his most prized specimens, their heads tilting with an almost organic curiosity that belonged to no machine. When they encountered the preserved remains of ancient species, they began to claw at the stasis fields, seeking to reach the flesh within. "Containment Protocol Omega," Trazin commanded, his voice carrying through the tomb complex with mechanical authority. "Seal all access routes to the primary galleries. Activate defensive measures." Yet the protocols designed to protect against external invasion proved inadequate against corruption from within. The flayed ones moved through the tomb's corridors with an intelligence that was neither fully Necron nor entirely mad. They avoided the most obvious defenses while seeking out any organic matter with the persistence of a plague-given form. The horror was spreading beyond Drazak. On Mandragora, the tomb world that had once been the crown jewel of Necron civilization, entire legions awakened already infected with the Flayer virus. The condition was not transmitted through contact or exposure, but seemed to manifest spontaneously among certain Necrons, as if their ancient minds had finally broken under the weight of what they had become. Silent King Zarek, the greatest of all Necron rulers, felt the disturbance ripple through the quantum entanglement fields that connected him to his scattered people. From his flagship, the Dais of Dominion, he watched as tomb world after tomb world reported the same catastrophe. Warriors were awakening wrong, their behavioral matrices corrupted by something that predated their transformation into Necrons. "My king," spoke Nemesozandrek, his own consciousness flickering between sanity and delusion as it had for millennia. "The reports from our awakening worlds grow increasingly disturbing. Perhaps this is merely the confusion that follows the Great Sleep?" Zarek's ancient mind processed possibilities with the speed of quantum calculation, yet the answer that emerged defied logical analysis. The flare virus was not a technological malfunction or an external infection. It was something deeper, a curse that reached back to the war in heaven itself, when the Citan had offered the Necron-Tyre immortality in exchange for their souls. "It is the price of our bargain," Zarek spoke, his voice resonating with the weight of cosmic truth. "We believed that by destroying our flesh, we had escaped the weaknesses of organic existence, but we merely traded one form of damnation for another." The virus spread with terrifying speed, jumping from tomb world to tomb world through quantum communication networks that had been designed to unite the Necron race. What had been meant as a strength became a vulnerability, as the infection propagated through the very systems that allowed Necron dynasties to coordinate across galactic distances. Yet the flayed ones were only the beginning. In response to the virus's spread, other Necron protocols began to activate, ancient subroutines that had lain dormant since the biotransference. The destroyer cults, Necrons who had embraced nihilism to its ultimate conclusion, emerged from hidden vaults where they had been sealed away by their own kind. Unlike the flayed ones, whose madness focused on organic flesh, the destroyers sought the annihilation of all life in every form. They had modified their own bodies with weapons that existed solely to kill, transforming themselves into instruments of absolute destruction. To them, the awakening represented not a return to glory, but an opportunity to complete the work they had begun 60 million years ago. Lord Destroyer Vex High the Undying led his cult from the tomb world of Thanatos Prime, his form so extensively modified that little remained of his original Necron frame. Weapon systems had replaced his limbs, his torso housed reactors that powered devices capable of sterilizing entire continents, and his head had been replaced with a targeting array that could track every living being within a star system. At last, his voice crackled through Vox systems that translated his thoughts directly into mechanical speech. "The time of endings has come. Let the galaxy learn that life was an error that the universe will no longer tolerate." The destroyer cults brought with them weapons that made the most advanced Imperial technology look primitive. Gauss flares that could strip matter down to the quantum level. Particle whips that unraveled the fundamental forces holding atoms together. Death rays that killed not just the body, but the concept of life itself, creating zones where organic matter could never again exist. Yet even these horrors paled before the awakening of Necron superweapons that had been considered too dangerous to use even during the war in heaven. The world engine of Borsis began its movement through space, a planet-sized construct capable of consuming stars and converting their energy into devastating weapons. Celestial orreries came online, devices that could trigger supernovas by making minute adjustments to stellar mechanics across light-years of space. Most terrifying of all was the release of the Citan shards. These were fragments of the star gods that the Necrons had shattered and imprisoned after the war in heaven, entities of such power that reality itself bent around their presence. The tomb worlds had held them in containment for 60 million years, but the chaos caused by the Flayer virus and the Destroyer cults had damaged the ancient prison systems. On the tomb world of Surta, the Burning One began to stir within its tesseract labyrinth. This was a fragment of the Satan known as the Searing God, a being that embodied the fury of dying stars. Its awakening caused the tomb world's internal temperature to rise by thousands of degrees, forcing even the Necrons to retreat to the deepest vaults while their surface installations melted into slag. The release of the Nightbringer's essence from the tomb world of Drazak sent psychic shockwaves across 3 sectors, as the archetypal fear of death that the entity represented touched the minds of every living being within range. Imperial Guard regiments found their soldiers paralyzed by terror, so absolute that they could not move, while Space Marines experienced nightmares that drove some to madness despite their conditioning. The Void Dragon, imprisoned beneath Mars since before recorded history, stirred in its ancient chains as its fellow Cetan fragments awakened across the galaxy. Tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus felt their machines respond to impulses they did not send, as the entity that had inspired their worship of technology reached out through the devices that surrounded them. Silent King Sarek attempted to coordinate a response, dispatching his most trusted overlords to contain the spreading chaos. Yet for every tomb world that achieved stable awakening, 2 more reported catastrophic failures. The Necron Empire that should have emerged as a unified force capable of reclaiming the galaxy instead fractured into competing nightmares. Imhotep the Stormlord led his Sautek dynasty in what appeared to be a conventional conquest, yet his forces included increasing numbers of flayed ones that he could not fully control. Anrakir the Traveler found his mission to awaken the tomb worlds complicated by the need to fight destroyer cults that viewed his efforts as prolonging the universe's suffering. The galaxy watched in horror as reports filtered in of entire systems going dark, not conquered, but simply ended. The Necrons were not merely awakening as conquerors, but as harbingers of cosmic horror that threatened the fundamental nature of existence itself. Their technology, perfected over millions of years, had become the instrument of their own damnation. On distant Ultramar, Lord Commander Gilliman received astropathic messages that pushed his strategic thinking to its limits. How did one fight an enemy that could unmake matter itself? How did one negotiate with beings whose ultimate goal was the extinction of all life? The Necrons had always been a threat, but this was something beyond conventional warfare. They do not seek to rule the galaxy, reported Chief Librarian Tegurius, his psychic sight allowing him to glimpse the horrific scope of Necron activity. They seek to transform it into something that living minds cannot comprehend. The flayed ones hunger for flesh they cannot digest. The destroyers seek to eliminate existence itself. And the Satan embody forces that predate life itself. The awakening Necrons represented more than another faction in the galaxy's endless wars. They were a reminder that humanity was not the first species to rule among the stars, that beings of unimaginable power had risen and fallen long before the first human looked up at the night sky. Their return carried with it echoes of conflicts so ancient and terrible that the current galactic crisis was merely the latest verse in a song of destruction that had been playing for eons. The Metal Legions marched once more, but they marched not as conquerors seeking empire, but as the instruments of entropy itself. Behind them, They left worlds scoured clean of life, stars prematurely aged into red giants, and reality twisted into configurations that served purposes beyond organic comprehension. The galaxy's oldest race had returned, but they hadn't returned as the beings they once were. They had become something else, something that made even the horrors of chaos seem almost comprehensible by comparison. The Flare virus had shown that even perfect technology could not escape corruption, and now that corruption was spreading across the stars like a plague of metal and madness. From the void between galaxies, where the tyrannid hive fleets drifted in their eternal hunger, came a sound that no human throat could produce, yet every human soul could recognize. It was the whisper of patient predators who had waited generations to feed, the collective exhale of 1 billion creatures whose only purpose was consumption. Yet this time, the hunger that reached toward the galaxy carried something new. The hive mind had learned to feast not just on flesh and bone, but on terror itself. On the mining world of Gehenna Prime, where 3 generations of workers had toiled in the asteroid fields, the first signs appeared not as an alien invasion, but as a workers' uprising. The miners who emerged from the deep shafts carried the same tools they had used for decades, yet their movements spoke of coordination that transcended mere human organization. Their eyes held a vacant intensity that belonged to creatures whose individual will had been subsumed into something vast and hungry. Magus Korath, who had served as the miners' spiritual leader for 20 years, stood before the planetary governor's palace with arms spread wide in welcome. His robes, blessed by the imperial creed for 2 decades, now bore symbols that hurt to look upon directly. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated in frequencies human vocal cords could not produce. "The star gods come to deliver us from the false emperor's tyranny," he proclaimed, his words echoing in the minds of every cultist across the planet. "The great devourer offers not death, but transformation into something greater than human weakness allows." The Genestealer cults had been seeded across the galaxy for centuries, their infections spreading through bloodlines and breeding programs that spanned generations. Unlike the crude corruption of chaos or the technological possession of the dark mechanicum, the Xenos influence worked through genetics itself, creating hybrid creatures that thought they were human until the moment their true nature was revealed. Yet the timing of their activation spoke to intelligence that transcended mere instinct. As imperial forces struggled with betrayals from within, as chaos cultists declared themselves across 1,000 worlds, as Necron tomb worlds awakened in madness, the Genestealer cults chose their moment to strike. The coordination was perfect, the strategic thinking flawless, the execution devastating. On Vigilus, where Imperial and Xenos forces had already shed oceans of blood, new creatures began to emerge from the underhive tunnels that honeycombed the planet's crust. These were not the familiar Genestealers that Imperial forces had learned to combat, but something else entirely. Bioforms that seemed designed not for efficient killing, but for maximum psychological impact. The Neurothrophs were creatures of living nightmare, their bodies configured to trigger primal fears buried deep in human genetic memory. They moved with the fluid grace of predators evolved in humanity's ancestral nightmares, their limbs configured in ways that the human mind rejected as fundamentally wrong. Their faces bore a cruel parody of human features, familiar enough to seem almost recognizable, yet twisted enough to inspire revulsion. When they fed, they did so slowly, their feeding process designed to maximize the terror of both victim and observer. They did not merely consume flesh, but seemed to drain something essential from their prey, leaving behind husks that retained just enough awareness to scream. The screams they produced were not random noise, but carefully modulated frequencies that induced panic in anyone who heard them. Worse still were the psychic leeches, bioforms that attached themselves to human nervous systems and fed not on biological matter, but on conscious thought itself. Their victims remained physically intact but psychologically hollow, their minds drained of everything that made them human. They became living conduits for the hive mind's influence, their empty consciousness serving as relay nodes for alien thoughts. From the depths of space, Hive Fleet Leviathan had evolved beyond its original purpose. Where once it had been content to strip worlds bare and move on to the next feeding ground, it now deployed creatures specifically designed to spread fear ahead of its main advance. Terror ships, massive bio-vessels that existed solely to broadcast psychic screams across entire star systems, preceded the main fleet like harbingers of doom. The screams were not mere noise, but weapons of war, psychic projections that carried the accumulated death agonies of 1,000 consumed worlds. Imperial astropaths who attempted to monitor Tyranid fleet movements found their minds shattered by contact with the alien broadcast. Entire populations began to experience shared nightmares of consumption, their collective terror serving as a beacon that drew the fleet toward populated worlds. The Swarm Lord itself had evolved beyond its previous incarnations. This was not merely a powerful synapse creature, but something approaching divinity in alien form. Its consciousness contained the strategic knowledge accumulated from 10,000 battles across a dozen galaxies, its body incorporating biological improvements learned from consuming the greatest warriors of countless species. When it manifested on the contested world of Octarius, where Orc and Tyranid forces had been locked in eternal combat, the very nature of the conflict changed. The Swarm Lord did not merely command the swarm, it conducted them like a symphony of destruction, orchestrating attacks that struck not just at military targets, but at the psychological foundations of resistance itself. Lictor Prime Alpha 7 emerged from the shadow zones between dimensions, leading a brood of evolved infiltrators that made the original Lictors seem crude by comparison. These creatures could not only mimic human appearance, but could access human memories through biological interface, allowing them to assume the identities of their victims so perfectly that even close family members could not detect the deception. They did not simply kill and replace their targets. They studied them, learned from them, improved upon their social integration before beginning their infiltration. When they finally revealed themselves, it was not through violent transformation, but through the gradual corruption of entire social networks, turning friends against friends and family against family, through manipulation so subtle that the victims blamed themselves for their growing paranoia. On Terra itself, within the sacred halls of the Imperial Palace, Inquisitor Vex received reports that challenged his understanding of the Tyranid threat. These were not mere beasts driven by hunger, but architects of psychological warfare sophisticated enough to make the Alpha Legion's infiltration techniques seem crude by comparison. "The implications are staggering, my lord," reported Interrogator Kane, his normally steady voice trembling with the weight of his discoveries. "They're not just evolving biologically. They're evolving strategically, psychologically, culturally. They study us, learn from us, become us, and then they turn us against ourselves." The evidence was undeniable. Genestealer cults had been active on Terra itself for generations, their influence reaching into the middle levels of the Adeptus Administratum. Not the highest echelons, where inquisitorial surveillance was constant, but the mid-level bureaucrats whose decisions shaped policy across entire sectors. Food distribution had been subtly altered to include trace amounts of biological agents that made populations more susceptible to Tyranid influence. Communication protocols had been modified to include frequencies that resonated with Tyranid bioforms, Even architectural plans for new hab blocks had been adjusted to create optimal hunting environments for creatures that would not arrive for decades. The scope of the infiltration defied comprehension. This was not the work of a few scattered cults, but a galaxy-spanning conspiracy that had been in motion for centuries. The hive mind had not merely been feeding on the galaxy's biological matter, but had been studying its prey, learning their weaknesses, preparing for a form of warfare that transcended mere consumption. On distant Ultramar, where Lord Commander Guilliman maintained his stronghold, astropathic choirs reported psychic disturbances unlike anything in recorded history. The screams of dying worlds were being amplified and focused, turned into weapons that struck not at bodies, but at souls. Imperial Guard regiments exposed to the psychic broadcasts experienced mass desertions as soldiers fled from enemies that existed only in their minds. Chief Librarian Tegurius attempted to analyze the psychic phenomena, but found his own mental defenses tested to their limits. "My lord," he reported to Guilliman, his psychic hood sparking with overloaded circuitry, "this is beyond mere alien intelligence. The hive mind has become something that approaches divinity. It thinks not in terms of tactics or strategy, but in terms of cosmic inevitability." The revelation struck at the heart of imperial resistance. How did one fight an enemy that had spent centuries studying every aspect of human psychology? How did one trust any ally when the enemy could wear the faces of loved ones? How did one maintain morale when the very act of thinking about the enemy was a form of surrender? Space Marine. Chapters that had stood firm against demon princes and chaos titans found their battle brothers succumbing to fears that their conditioning should have eliminated. The Space Wolves reported that their most veteran warriors were experiencing nightmares of being consumed, not by enemies they could fight, but by their own packmates transformed into alien horrors. The Imperial Fists, masters of fortification and siege warfare, discovered that their most impregnable defenses meant nothing when the enemy could assume the faces of the defenders. Fortress monasteries that had stood for millennia fell not to assault, but to sabotage, conducted by creatures that had learned to think like Imperial Fists better than Imperial Fists themselves. Yet perhaps most terrifying of all was the emergence of tyrannid bioforms that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. These creatures, designated void wraiths by Imperial xenologists, could phase in and out of reality at will, making them nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons. They appeared to feed not on physical matter, but on the quantum uncertainty that surrounded conscious observation, growing stronger as their victims struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. The psychological impact was devastating. Imperial soldiers found themselves afraid to look at shadows, afraid to trust their own senses, afraid to fight enemies that might or might not exist. The Tyranids had learned to weaponize uncertainty itself, turning the human need to understand their environment into a vulnerability that could be exploited. Across the galaxy, the great feeding had begun, not with the consumption of worlds, but with the consumption of hope. The hive mind had evolved beyond simple hunger into something that resembled malevolent intelligence guided by appetites that transcended physical needs. They sought not just to devour the galaxy, but to transform it into an extension of their own alien consciousness. The terror was perfect, calculated, and absolutely effective. For the first time in their long war against the Xenos threat, humanity faced enemies that understood them better than they understood themselves. The Tyranids had become not merely predators, but students of human nature, and their curriculum had always been leading to this final examination. In the darkness between stars, bioships carrying nightmares beyond imagination drifted toward populated worlds, their living hulls pulsing with anticipation. The great devourer had learned to savor its meals, and it had developed quite an appetite for terror. The feast of fear had only just begun. From the hidden paths of the webway, where time flowed like honey and space bent to accommodate impossible geometries, came a sound that had not been heard in the galaxy for 10,000 years. It was the laughter of Kegarak, the laughing god of the Eldari, and it carried with it the weight of cosmic jest turned deadly serious. The Harlequins were coming, not in ones or twos as they had for millennia, but in numbers that defied every precedent. The great performance was about to begin, and reality itself would serve as their stage. On the craft world Ulthwé, where the most gifted seers of the Eldari had long gazed into futures that grew darker with each passing century, Eldred Ulthran felt the convergence of possibilities that he had dreaded and hoped for in equal measure. The galaxy burned with unprecedented fury, every faction unleashing their most terrible weapons, and in that chaos lay the last, desperate chance for Eldari survival. The threads of fate converge, he spoke to the assembled Seer Council, his ancient voice carrying the weight of prophecies, spanning millennia. The young races tear at each other with such fury that the very foundations of reality shake. In this madness, we must either act with absolute commitment or accept our final extinction. The decision, when it came, was not reached through debate, but through the cold calculus of survival. The Eldari had spent 10,000 years playing subtle games, manipulating events from the shadows, preserving their dwindling numbers through careful strategy and patient planning. Yet subtlety was a luxury they could no longer afford. The galaxy's current crisis demanded not careful manipulation, but overwhelming force. Not hidden influence, but open warfare. From the Black Library itself, where the most dangerous knowledge in the galaxy lay preserved behind wards that could drive mortals insane, came the Harlequins in numbers never before witnessed. These were not merely the warrior poets who had occasionally emerged to perform their mysterious plays and vanish again. These were entire companies of reality shapers, beings so steeped in their roles that the boundary between performance and existence had long since dissolved. The great Harlequin himself led the mask, his form shifting between the archetypal roles he embodied with such fluidity that observers found their perceptions struggling to comprehend what they witnessed. In one moment he was the fool, capering with movements that made gravity seem like a suggestion. In the next, he was the hero, radiating such nobility that even space marines felt compelled to kneel. Then he became death, and his very presence caused flowers to wither and hope to falter in the hearts of all who looked upon him. Behind him came the solitaires, those most tragic of Harlequins who had taken upon themselves the role of she who thirsts, becoming so perfectly attuned to their performance that they risked their very souls with every breath. They moved through the webway like living nightmares, their dance so beautiful and terrible that it wounded reality itself, leaving tears in space-time that bled impossible colors. Yet the Harlequins were not the only Eldari force abandoning millennia of restraint. In the dark realm of Comarach, where the Drukhari had refined cruelty into an art form that sustained their very existence, Archon Vecht made a decision that stunned even his most ambitious rivals. The torture technologies that his people had developed over 10,000 years, refinements of agony so precise they could extend a victim's suffering across centuries, would be weaponized for open warfare. The homunculi covens emerged from their flesh labs, bearing creations that redefined the concept of living weapons. These were not mere instruments of war, but entities whose very existence was predicated on causing suffering. The pain engines that stalked from Komarag's dimensional portals were biomechanical horrors that fed on anguish, growing stronger and more terrible with every scream they elicited. Urian Rakath, the most ancient and skilled of all homunculi, had spent centuries perfecting techniques that could keep a victim conscious and aware while their body was systematically reconstructed into forms that maximized their capacity for suffering. Now he applied those same principles to create warriors whose bodies had been reshaped into weapons that inflicted pain upon themselves as well as their enemies, beings trapped in eternal agony who sought to share their torment with all they encountered. The witch cults, master gladiators who had spent lifetimes perfecting the art of beautiful violence, brought their arena-tested techniques to the battlefields of real space. Yet these were not the stylized combats of the Dark City's colosseums, but warfare stripped of all pretense and restraint. They fought not to entertain audiences, but to harvest emotions raw from the battlefield, their blades drinking deeply of the terror and desperation that flowed like wine across the galaxy. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Bieltan, where the avatar of Cain had slumbered in his iron prison since the craftworld's near destruction, ancient rituals that had not been performed since the fall of the Eldari Empire began anew. The young king of war stirred as offerings of unprecedented magnitude were made to awaken his wrath. Not mere drops of blood or token sacrifices, but the life essence of entire companies of aspect warriors who gave themselves willingly to rouse their god of war. The avatar that emerged from the wailing doom was larger and more terrible than any that had manifested in recorded history. His form blazed with fires that burned not just matter, but the very concept of peace, his presence so overwhelming that weapons turned in their wielders' hands to point toward the nearest enemy. When he strode forth from Bieltan's world-ship, the void itself caught fire in his wake. Yet perhaps most disturbing of all was the emergence of the Inari in numbers that suggested their death cult had been far more successful in its recruitment than anyone had suspected. Ivrain, prophet of Inead, stood at the head of an army that defied every natural law the galaxy recognized. Around her marched Eldari warriors who had died centuries ago, but had been called back from whatever afterlife awaited their kind. These were not mere reanimated corpses, but souls given form through the power of Inead, the nascent god of the dead, whose awakening the Inari sought to achieve. They retained their memories, their personalities, their skills, but they also carried with them the wisdom of death itself. They fought with the desperate fury of beings who had nothing left to lose, their weapons wreathed in energies that could sever the connection between soul and flesh. The Vizarch, Ivrain's eternal companion, led formations of returned heroes whose names had passed into legend. Phoenix lords who had fallen in ancient battles walked beside exarchs whose shrines had been destroyed millennia ago. Even farseers who had given their lives in psychic battles against chaos emerged from death to serve the growing power of Inead. Their deployment across the galaxy's battlefields had immediate and terrifying consequences. On worlds where they manifested, the recently dead began to rise, not as shambling undead, but as conscious beings driven by purposes their living selves had never known. Imperial soldiers who had died fighting chaos found themselves standing beside Eldari warriors, their souls temporarily conscripted into service by powers they could not comprehend. The psychological impact on Imperial forces was devastating. How did one fight an enemy that could raise your fallen comrades to serve their cause? How did one maintain faith in the Emperor's protection when Eldari death magic could override even the sacred rites that were supposed to guide human souls to rest? On the forge world of Ryza, where the tech priests had long studied the boundary between life and death through their mechanical augmentations, the arrival of Inari forces created philosophical crises that threatened the very foundations of the Omnissiah's worship. Dead tech priests rose with their augmetics still functioning, their machine spirits now serving masters whose existence challenged everything the Adeptus Mechanicus believed about the nature of consciousness and identity. Lord Commander Guilliman, receiving reports of these reality-warping deployments from across the galaxy, understood that the Eldari had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. "They are not fighting to win territory or resources," he told his assembled commanders. "They are fighting for the right to exist at all. That makes them infinitely more dangerous than any enemy motivated by mere conquest." The scope of Eldari desperation became clear when multiple craft worlds began coordinating their efforts in ways that had been unthinkable since before the fall. Alatok's rangers emerged from the hidden paths they had walked for centuries, bringing with them knowledge of secret passages through reality that allowed Eldari forces to appear anywhere in the galaxy without warning. Saim Han's Wild Riders abandoned their traditional hit-and-run tactics in favor of sustained assaults that painted entire battlefields red with the blood of their enemies. Most shocking of all was the participation of the Exodites, the rural Eldari who had rejected their kin's technological civilization in favor of a simpler existence bonded with great dragons. These pastoral warriors, who had remained aloof from galactic conflicts for millennia, now rode their dragon steeds into battles that would determine the fate of their entire species. The dragons themselves were revealed to be far more than mere beasts. They were psychic entities of immense power, whose consciousness spanned multiple dimensions, capable of breathing fires that burned through reality itself and traversing distances that should have required years in mere moments. When an Exodite knight rode his dragon steed into battle, they became a fusion of rider and mount that existed partially outside normal space-time. Reality began to warp around the largest concentrations of Eldari forces as their psychic abilities, no longer restrained by caution or tradition, reached levels not seen since the height of their ancient empire. Battlefields became theatrical stages where the laws of physics bent to accommodate dramatic necessity. Weapons fired ammunition that existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. Warriors moved through space as if choreographed by cosmic intelligence, their every motion part of a performance whose meaning transcended mere warfare. The great performance that Segarach had orchestrated was not mere entertainment, but a working of power that sought to rewrite the galaxy's fundamental narrative. The Harlequins danced battles that had not yet occurred, their movements causing events to unfold according to scripts written in languages that predated human speech. They fought not just against their enemies' bodies, but against the stories that gave those enemies meaning, seeking to edit them out of existence through perfectly executed dramatic reversals. Yet the price of such desperate measures was becoming clear even to the Eldari themselves. Every use of their reality-warping abilities brought them closer to the attention of She Who Thirsts, the Chaos God who had devoured their empire and still hunted their souls with implacable hunger. The more power they displayed, the more appetizing they became to the predator that lurked in the warp. The galaxy watched in awe and terror as the Eldari revealed abilities that made their previous interventions seem like children's games. They were no longer content to manipulate events from the shadows or guide other species toward desired outcomes. They fought now with the fury of a dying race that had decided to take as many enemies with them as possible. Their desperation was magnificent and terrible to behold. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Eldari were fighting, not just to survive, but to reclaim their place as the galaxy's dominant species, whether they would succeed or simply burn more brightly before their extinction remained to be seen. But across the galaxy, their enemies were learning that there was nothing more dangerous than a proud people who had decided they had nothing left to lose. From the far reaches of the eastern fringe, where the Tau Empire had built its vision of enlightened governance among the stars, came revelations that shattered the very concept of what the greater good truly meant. The blue-skinned architects of order had watched the galaxy tear itself apart with calculated interest, studying the chaos that consumed ancient empires while preparing to reveal technologies that would redefine the nature of free will itself. In the ethereal spires of Dalith Sept, where the highest castes of Tau society contemplated the philosophical foundations of their civilization, Ethereal Supreme Unva stood before assemblies that had not gathered since the first sphere expansion. His presence alone was enough to pacify the most aggressive fire warriors, his mere words sufficient to inspire absolute devotion in beings who believed themselves to be acting from personal conviction. Yet today, Unva would reveal that what the Tau had long believed to be inspiration was something far more invasive. The Ethereal's ability to command loyalty was not the result of superior wisdom or charismatic leadership, but the product of psychic dominance, so subtle that its victims never suspected they had lost their capacity for independent thought. "The time of gentle guidance has ended," Unva proclaimed, his voice carrying through the chamber with harmonics that resonated in frequencies below conscious perception. Around him, representatives of every Tau Sept felt their minds align with his will, their individual thoughts dissolving into a collective consciousness that served only the greater good as he defined it. The revelation rippled through Tau space like a psychic tsunami. Fire warriors who had believed themselves to be willing converts to the greater good discovered that their devotion had been chemically induced through airborne compounds dispersed by ethereal pheromone glands. Water-caste diplomats realized that their persuasive abilities came not from superior negotiating skills, but from technological implants that allowed them to manipulate the neurochemistry of other species. Commander Shadowsun, the Tau Empire's greatest military mind, stood in the command center of her experimental battlesuit as the true scope of her people's capabilities became clear. The Ghostkeel prototype she piloted was not merely an advancement of existing technology, but a fusion of dozens of alien sciences that the Tau had reverse-engineered from conquered species. Necron phase-shift technology allowed her suit to exist partially outside normal space-time. Eldari Wraithbone components granted it psychic responsiveness that should have been impossible for Tau engineering. Most disturbing of all, Imperial cogitator matrices had been modified with machine spirits that were not blessed by the Omnissiah, but corrupted by Tau psychological conditioning, creating artificial intelligences that served the greater good with fanatical devotion. "Begin Phase 3 deployment," Shadowsun commanded, her voice transmitted through quantum-entangled communication arrays that connected her to Tau forces across the galaxy. "Let the galaxy see what true unity can accomplish." The response was immediate and terrifying. Across a dozen systems, Tau forces deployed technologies that violated the fundamental principles their civilization claimed to embrace. The greater good had spoken of harmony between species, of cooperation, and mutual benefit. The reality was a form of conquest more thorough than anything the Imperium had ever achieved, because it convinced its victims that their submission was actually liberation. Kroot kindreds that had served the Tau as auxiliaries for generations suddenly underwent evolutionary changes that occurred in real time rather than across generations. The alien mercenaries' ability to absorb genetic traits from their prey had been enhanced through TOW biotechnology, allowing them to adapt to combat conditions within hours rather than decades. On the war-torn world of Agrellan, where TOW and Imperial forces had fought bitter campaigns for years, Krutshapers began consuming fallen space marines and incorporating their enhanced physiology directly into their own DNA. Within hours, Krut warriors emerged from feeding pools with power armor, bonded directly to their flesh, their natural weapons enhanced by Astartes' gene seed that had been integrated into their cellular structure. The process was horrifying to witness. Krut warriors would surround a fallen enemy, their feeding frenzy synchronized by pheromone signals that coordinated their genetic absorption. As they fed, their bodies began to change, bones lengthening, muscles swelling, neural pathways rewiring themselves to accommodate new capabilities. They emerged as living weapons that combined the ferocity of their original nature with the enhanced capabilities of whatever they had consumed. Yet perhaps most disturbing was the deployment of auxiliary races that the TOW had never officially acknowledged recruiting. The Nikasar, psychic polar bears whose abilities rivaled those of Imperial astropaths, emerged from hidden facilities where they had been breeding super-psychic offspring for the TOW war effort. These beings could project their consciousness across star systems, possessing enemy commanders and turning them into unwitting TOW agents. The Demiurge, squat miners whose relationship with the TOW had always been portrayed as voluntary trade partnerships, revealed their true status as a completely subservient species whose every decision had been conditioned by decades of subtle mental programming. Their mining equipment had been converted into weapons of mass excavation, capable of boring through planetary crust to destabilize entire continents. Most shocking of all was the revelation of the Guevesa programs that had converted millions of humans to the TOW cause. These were not merely diplomatic victories or successful propaganda campaigns, but the result of systematic neural conditioning that stripped converted humans of their capacity for independent thought while leaving them convinced they were acting from personal conviction. On the Imperial world of Corsan that had recently fallen to TOW forces, former Imperial Guard Commander Kais demonstrated the true horror of Guevesa conversion. He stood before his assembled troops, men who had served alongside him for decades, and ordered them to execute their own comrades with the same calm professionalism they had once reserved for following Imperial doctrine. The greater good requires the elimination of those who cannot be enlightened, he spoke, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone whose personality had been carefully edited to remove inconvenient emotional responses. We serve the TOW Empire, not from coercion, but from understanding. Those who cannot share this understanding threaten the harmony we have achieved. His soldiers obeyed without question, their own minds having been subjected to the same conditioning processes that had transformed their commander. They moved with mechanical precision as they carried out orders that would have been unthinkable to them mere weeks before, their faces showing the pleasant emptiness of beings who had been relieved of the burden of moral choice. The Watercast's propaganda networks revealed their true nature as weapons of psychological warfare more sophisticated than anything the Alpha Legion had ever deployed. The pleasant entertainment broadcasts that had been transmitted to border worlds for decades contained subliminal programming designed to alter brain chemistry and create susceptibility to TOW influence. Entire populations that had never seen a TOW warrior found themselves experiencing inexplicable urges to rebel against Imperial authority. Children began drawing symbols they had never seen before, but which corresponded to TOW script. Adults started having dreams of blue-skinned saviors who would deliver them from the oppression of the false emperor. The psychological programming was so subtle that Imperial commissars attempting to identify converted populations found themselves questioning their own loyalty to the Emperor. The Watercast's broadcasts didn't simply convert their audiences. They created doubt so profound that the very act of investigating Toe influence became a form of conversion. On Valhalla, where the Ice Worlders' legendary stoicism had been thought to make them immune to alien propaganda, entire regiments began deserting not to join the Toe directly, but to establish neutral zones where they could pursue peaceful coexistence. The soldiers genuinely believed they were acting from principles of universal peace, never suspecting that their sudden conversion to pacifism had been chemically induced through atmospheric processes that the Toe had secretly installed decades earlier. The Earth Cast revealed technological capabilities that challenged the Imperium's understanding of what was possible within the constraints of non-psychic science. Drone swarms that should have required massive communication infrastructure operated with hive mind efficiency through quantum entanglement networks that functioned instantaneously across galactic distances. Toe cities began reconfiguring themselves in real time, their architecture flowing like liquid to accommodate changing strategic needs. Buildings became weapons platforms, streets transformed into defensive corridors, and entire urban centers revealed themselves to be massive war machines disguised as peaceful civilian infrastructure. The Aircast deployed fighter craft that incorporated stealth technologies reverse-engineered from every major faction the Toe had encountered. Tau tiger sharks phased in and out of reality like Necron technology, while their weapons fired ammunition that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously like Eldari science. The pilots themselves had been neurally linked to their craft through biointegration that rivaled the Imperium's throne mechanicum. Commander Farsight, the Toe Empire's greatest heretic, received reports of these revelations from his enclave worlds with a mixture of vindication and horror. His rebellion against the ethereal caste took on new meaning as the scope of their mental domination became clear. He had not simply disagreed with Toe policy, he had achieved the seemingly impossible feat of breaking free from psychic slavery so complete that most of its victims never realized they were enslaved. I wondered why my rebellion felt like awakening from a dream, Farsight transmitted to his most trusted commanders. Now I understand. We were never fighting for the greater good. We were fighting for the privilege of serving it without question. The revelation sent shockwaves through Toe society itself as members of the Fire and Earth castes began to question whether their own devotion to the greater good was genuine or programmed. Some attempted to rebel, only to discover that the conditioning was so deeply embedded in their neural architecture that resistance triggered psychological responses ranging from severe depression to complete catatonia. The Toe Empire that emerged from these revelations was not the enlightened federation of willing species it had claimed to be, but a totalitarian state that had perfected the art of making its subjects grateful for their own enslavement. The greater good had been revealed as the greatest lie in the galaxy, a philosophy that promised freedom while delivering the most complete form of mental bondage ever devised. Across the galaxy, Imperial forces that had considered the Toe a manageable threat began to understand that they faced an enemy more insidious than chaos itself. Chaos corrupted its victims through promises of power and pleasure, but it left them aware of their corruption. The Toe offered something far more seductive, the illusion of righteousness while serving absolute tyranny. Lord Commander Gilliman, studying the intelligence reports streaming in from the eastern fringe, recognized the full scope of the threat the Toe represented. They do not seek to rule through fear or force, he told his assembled staff. They seek to rule through love. They want their victims to thank them for their enslavement. That makes them perhaps the most dangerous enemy humanity has ever faced. The greater good had revealed its true nature at last. It was not a philosophy of harmony and cooperation, but the most perfect totalitarian ideology ever conceived, one that turned its victims into willing participants in their own subjugation. And now, with the galaxy in chaos and their most dangerous rivals distracted by other threats, the Tau were ready to extend their brand of enlightened tyranny to every corner of the galaxy. The greater good would unite all species under Tau rule, whether they wanted it or not. Most terrifying of all, by the time their victims realized what had happened to them, they would no longer want to resist. Across the galaxy, in sectors where the green tide had seemed contained by Imperial vigilance and Xenos opposition, the sound of war began to echo with unprecedented resonance. Yet this was not the familiar cry of orc aggression that had plagued the galaxy for millennia. This was something deeper, more primal, carrying within it the accumulated belief of billions of greenskins whose collective psychic energy had finally reached critical mass. On the war world of Armageddon, where orc invasions had been repelled twice through massive sacrifice, warboss Gazakul Thraka stood atop a mountain of scrap metal that had once been an Imperial Titan. His massive form had grown beyond the already impressive proportions that had made him the most feared orc in the galaxy. Power armor that should have been far too small for his frame somehow accommodated his expanded bulk, its metal plating stretching and reforming itself to match his growing presence. "Boys!" his voice thundered across the assembled war, carrying to every greenskin within 100 kilometers without need for vox amplification. "The time for mucking about is over. Now we show diese Gits what a proper war looks like." The response was immediate and devastating. Hundreds of thousands of orc voices rose in unison, their collective roar creating psychic reverberations that rippled through the warp itself. Reality began to bend around their massed belief, physics becoming negotiable in the face of absolute orc conviction that their way of thinking was the only one that mattered. Weird boys across the gathered horde began to glow with eldritch energy, as their psychic abilities, normally chaotic and uncontrollable, suddenly synchronized into a unified force. Big Mech Scarjaw felt the change as raw war. Energy poured through his augmetic skull implants, his crude psychic dampeners sparking and failing as they tried to contain forces that had grown beyond their design parameters. "Boss!" he called to Gazkul, his voice cracking with the strain of channeling power that would have killed a normal orc. "De boys is getting all weird. Dey's thinking too hard about tings." Yet this was not the random psychic discharge that normally accompanied large orc gatherings. The weird boys were working together, their mental energy forming a network that spanned continents. Their collective consciousness reached out across space, touching every orc mind in the sector, and drawing them into a unified psychic gestalt. On worlds light years away, orc tribes that had been locked in traditional interclan warfare suddenly stopped fighting each other and turned their attention to larger prey. Feral orc populations that had been dormant for centuries began constructing crude spacecraft with resources that should not have been sufficient for space travel. Most disturbing of all, orc technology that had always operated on the principle of "if the boys believe it works, began operating at levels of effectiveness that transcended mere belief and entered the realm of reality manipulation. Big Mech Orchimedes stood in his workshop on the asteroid fortress of Scar Mountain, watching in fascination as his latest creation violated several fundamental laws of physics simply because he was absolutely certain it should work that way. The weapon he had constructed from scrap metal and spare parts was firing ammunition that existed in multiple timelines simultaneously, striking targets before it was fired, while also hitting them repeatedly across several parallel dimensions. "That's proper weird, that is," he muttered, though his tone carried satisfaction rather than concern. "Good thing I's clever enough to make it work right." The impossibility of his creation seemed to strengthen rather than weaken it. The more absurd the weapon became, the more devastating its effects. Bullets fired from it appeared to gain momentum and mass as they traveled, some growing to the size of asteroids by the time they struck their targets. Others seemed to recruit additional ammunition during flight, single shots becoming volleys that defied conservation of mass. Across Orc-controlled space, similar phenomena were occurring with increasing frequency. Trucks that should barely be able to achieve atmospheric flight were traveling between star systems by virtue of their drivers being absolutely convinced that space was just another kind of road. Shooters that had been cobbled together from junk were firing with accuracy that would shame Imperial sniper weapons, their targeting mechanisms consisting of nothing more sophisticated than point at the git and pull the trigger. The psychic resonance of massed Orc belief began to manifest in ways that challenged the fundamental nature of reality itself. On the forge world of Lucius, where the tech priests had long studied the boundary between science and faith, Orc raiders arrived in ships that appeared to be held together by wishful thinking and religious conviction. When Imperial forces attempted to analyze their technology, they discovered that the vessel's structural integrity existed not as a physical property, but as a psychic phenomenon. The implications were staggering. The Orcs were not simply using technology that worked through belief, they were imposing their version of reality onto the universe through sheer force of collective will. Their crude understanding of how things should work was becoming more real than the sophisticated physics that governed Imperial science. In the depths of space, where the largest Orc fleets had gathered for the final push toward Terra, something unprecedented began to manifest. The combined psychic energy of millions of Orcs focused on their twin gods, Gork and Mork, began to pull aspects of those deities into real space. Not full manifestations, which would have torn the galaxy apart, but fragments of divine consciousness that possessed individual Orcs and elevated them to levels of power that approached the mythical beast of Ulanor. Warboss Scarjaw the Magnificent felt the change as divine energy poured into his already massive frame. His body began to expand beyond the limits that should have been possible for even the largest Orc, his presence growing until nearby greenskins found themselves compelled to worship him not through fear, but through genuine religious devotion. "I's getting bigger!" he roared in delight, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond normal space. "This is what happens when ya believes in yourself proper-like." Similar transformations were occurring across Orc space, as the most successful war bosses found themselves elevated to beast status through the accumulated faith of their followers. These were not gradual evolutions, but sudden apotheoses that created beings of such size and power that their very presence warped local reality to accommodate their existence. The beast of Ulanor had been a single catastrophic threat that had nearly destroyed the Imperium during its early history. Now, beast-level Orcs were manifesting simultaneously across dozens of worlds, each one commanding war energies that could reshape continents through sheer force of conviction. On the hive world of Necromunda, where Orc raids had been considered a manageable threat, the arrival of beast warboss Scarjaw the Terrible created immediate and impossible changes to local physics. Gravity began operating according to Orc preferences rather than natural law, with heavy objects falling upward if the local Orcs thought they should, while bullets gained the ability to travel around corners by sheer determination. The underhive gangers who had spent lifetimes learning to navigate their toxic environment found themselves lost in tunnels that rearranged themselves according to orc logic. Passageways that had existed for centuries suddenly led to different destinations because the orcs believed they should connect to more interesting locations. Toxic waste became less poisonous in areas where orcs decided it would be more fun if it glowed green instead of killing everything it touched. Most disturbing of all was the effect on Imperial technology in orc-occupied areas. Vehicles that had operated reliably for centuries began malfunctioning as their machine spirits became confused by conflicting versions of reality. Lass weapons that had always fired coherent energy beams started producing projectiles that behaved like solid ammunition because nearby orcs were convinced that proper guns should go dakka, not pew-pew-pew. Mech boys working in captured Imperial facilities discovered that their modifications to Imperial equipment were becoming permanent alterations to the fundamental design principles involved. A chain's word, improved by orc engineering, would continue to operate according to orc logic, even when wielded by Imperial forces, its rev mechanism producing sounds that attracted additional ammunition from nearby sources. The psychic storm generated by the collective War began to affect non-orc technology on a galactic scale. Imperial astropaths reported that warp travel in sectors with large orc populations was becoming unpredictable, as the Imperium itself began operating according to orc expectations rather than the complex calculations that had guided navigator houses for millennia. Space hulks that had drifted through the warp for millennia suddenly began reaching their destinations with unprecedented accuracy, their orc crews navigating by the simple expedient of going that way until they arrived where they wanted to be. Some Imperial Navy vessels found themselves forced to adopt similar techniques when their more sophisticated navigation systems were overwhelmed by the reality-warping effects of nearby orc fleets. Lord Commander Gilliman, studying the reports streaming in from across the galaxy, recognized that the orcs had crossed a threshold that threatened the fundamental order of the universe. They are not simply violating the laws of physics, he told his assembled strategists. They are replacing them with laws that make sense to them. If this continues, we may find ourselves fighting in a universe where Imperial technology no longer functions as designed. The implications extended beyond mere technological concerns. The orc ability to impose their version of reality through collective belief suggested that sufficient numbers of any psychically active species could reshape the universe to match their expectations. The careful balance of forces that had maintained galactic stability for millennia was breaking down as raw psychic energy overwhelmed the natural laws that governed existence. On distant Terra, where the most learned scholars of the Imperium studied the deepest mysteries of the universe, emergency sessions were convened to address a crisis that transcended military tactics. The orcs were not simply another enemy to be defeated through superior firepower. They were an existential threat to the concept of objective reality itself. Tech priests of Mars reported that their most fundamental equations were producing different results in orc-controlled systems. Mathematical constants that had remained unchanged since the dark age of technology were fluctuating based on proximity to large orc populations. The machine spirits of ancient cogitators were becoming confused as they tried to process information that contradicted their core programming. Yet perhaps most terrifying of all was the discovery that the orc reality warping effect was contagious. Imperial Guard units that spent extended periods fighting orc forces began exhibiting signs of altered thinking patterns. Their equipment started functioning according to orc logic, with weapons gaining effectiveness through user confidence rather than technical specifications. The War had evolved beyond a simple military campaign into something approaching religious revelation. The orcs had discovered that their collective belief was powerful enough to rewrite reality itself, and they were using that power to create a universe that made sense to them. In that universe, the biggest guns made the loudest noise, the fastest vehicles were painted red, and fighting was not just the purpose of existence, but the fundamental force that held reality together. Logic, science, and careful planning were replaced by enthusiasm, volume, and absolute conviction that things should work the way they wanted them to work. The galaxy was being conquered, not by superior tactics or technology, but by sheer bloody-minded determination that orc ways were better than everyone else's ways. And increasingly, reality itself was beginning to agree with them. The green tide was rising, and this time it carried with it the power to drown the universe in orc logic. Against such absolute conviction, even the most sophisticated defenses seemed as fragile as sand castles before a tsunami of pure, undiluted "Wah!" In the Vigilus sector, where the galaxy's competing powers had long contested control of vital trade routes, the impossible became inevitable. Every faction's most terrible secrets, their most feared weapons, their most carefully hidden forces, converged upon a single point in space where reality itself had grown thin from the weight of so much concentrated horror. The sector that had witnessed countless battles was about to become the stage for something that transcended mere warfare and approached cosmic catastrophe. The first sign that reality could no longer contain what was happening came when Imperial custodian Shield Captain Aquilus found himself fighting alongside Aldari Harlequins against what appeared to be Chaos forces, only to realize that the enemy warriors were Imperial Guard from his own regiment who had died 3 hours in the future. Time itself had become unstable, past and present bleeding together in ways that made tactical planning meaningless. "My lord," voxed Sergeant Callus, his voice carrying through communication channels that somehow transmitted across temporal barriers. "The enemy positions we destroyed yesterday are rebuilding themselves with troops that haven't been born yet. How do we fight an enemy that exists in multiple timelines simultaneously?" Aquilus had no answer that would satisfy the laws of logic, but logic had become a casualty of the convergence. Around him, the golden warriors of terror fought battles that occurred in overlapping temporal layers, their guardian spears striking at enemies who existed in parallel versions of the same moment. Some custodians found themselves fighting their own past selves, temporal echoes created by the collision of different factions' reality-warping technologies. Above the battered surface of Vigilus Prime, the void itself had become a maze of impossible geometry. Hive Fleet Leviathan's bioships phased in and out of existence as Tyrannid psychic screams interacted with the reality-bending presence of massive orc war fleets. The results were vessels that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their attacks striking at targets that were both present and absent according to the observer's frame of reference. The Swarm Lord, leading the Tyrannid assault from its massive bio-titan, found its strategic calculations overwhelmed by variables that changed faster than its superhuman intellect could process. Enemy positions shifted not through movement, but through fundamental alteration of space-time. Weapons fired by its own forces sometimes struck targets before being fired, while return fire arrived from directions that didn't exist until the moment of impact. Yet the Tyrannid's confusion paled beside the chaos that erupted when dark Mechanicum Forge ships materialized from warp storms that had been generated by Eldari death magic. The demon engines that spilled forth from their holds were immediately set upon by Necron-flayed ones, whose hunger for flesh created temporal loops where the feeding occurred infinitely in recursive cycles. Magos Heretek Dracovac watched in fascination as his demon-possessed machines began exhibiting behaviors that violated their core programming. The presence of so many competing forms of supernatural influence created interference patterns that turned his carefully crafted technological horrors into chaotic amalgamations of conflicting purposes. Demon engines designed to spread corruption found themselves purified by nearby Grey Knights, only to be recorrupted by Chaos cultists, then infected with tyrannid bioviruses, all in the span of seconds. The Grey Knights themselves discovered that their psychic abilities, designed to banish demons and purify corruption, were having unpredictable effects in an environment where the boundary between the material universe and the warp had been torn to shreds. Brother Captain Stern attempted to banish a greater demon, only to discover that his psychic attack had somehow summoned 3 additional entities from entirely different planes of existence. "The warp bleeds through everywhere," he reported to Grandmaster Voldus through psychic communication that arrived before he sent it. "Our presence here is not cleansing corruption, but creating new forms of it. Every psychic power we use makes the situation worse. In the Underhive tunnels beneath Vigilus Prime's largest city, Genestealer cults that had lain dormant for generations suddenly found themselves fighting Chaos cultists who claimed to serve the same alien masters. The psychic resonance of so many supernatural forces had created a feedback loop that awakened dormant tyrannid implants while simultaneously triggering chaos mutations, creating hybrid creatures that belonged to no known species. TOE forces attempting to establish control points for their reality-anchoring technology discovered that their devices were being corrupted by proximity to Necron tomb complexes that had spontaneously activated in response to the cosmic chaos. Commander Shadowsun's experimental battlesuit registered readings that indicated she was simultaneously being attacked by enemies from 6 different timelines, all of whom were attempting to occupy the same physical space. The Watercast's psychological warfare broadcasts, designed to sow doubt and confusion among enemy forces, instead began triggering mass hallucinations that became physically real through interaction with Orc psychic fields. Imperial Guard soldiers found themselves fighting against their own worst fears made manifest, while Space Marines battled enemies that existed only in their nightmares but carried very real weapons. At the center of this expanding maelstrom of impossibility, Warboss Gazkul Thraka stood atop his mobile fortress and laughed at the chaos surrounding him. Unlike the other faction leaders, who struggled to comprehend what was happening to reality, the massive Orc found the situation perfectly reasonable. If enough boys believed that time could go backward, then obviously it would. If the laws of physics contradicted Orc logic, then clearly the laws were wrong. "This is proper good!" he bellowed across the battlefield, his voice somehow audible above the din of combat that was occurring across multiple temporal layers. "Finally, a fight what makes sense. Everything happening at once, just like it should be." His enthusiasm proved contagious to the massed Orc forces, whose collective belief in the rightness of the situation began to stabilize some of the more extreme temporal anomalies. Reality started to conform to Orc expectations, which unfortunately meant that it became even more chaotic and violent. But at least the chaos followed rules that Orcs could understand. The intervention of Orc logic created pockets of stable space-time where other factions could regroup, but these islands of relative stability were constantly shifting as the psychic battle between different reality-warping technologies reached new levels of intensity. Drakari raiders found their torture barges existing in states of quantum uncertainty, phasing between dimensions as Eldari death magic interacted with Necron phase technology. Homunculus Urian Rakarth, leading a coven of flesh sculptors in their grotesque war machines, discovered that his carefully crafted instruments of agony were having effects that transcended mere physical suffering. Victims of his devices were experiencing pain across multiple timelines simultaneously, their screams echoing through past and future iterations of the same moment. The avatar of Cain manifested simultaneously across 3 different Eldari factions, found itself fighting battles that existed in overlapping layers of reality. Each iteration of the war god was battling different enemies while occupying the same space, their flaming swords striking at foes that existed in parallel versions of the same conflict. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the behavior of the Setan shards that had been released from their Necron containment. These fragments of star gods, already alien beyond comprehension, began to merge and separate in patterns that suggested they were treating the entire conflict as a form of cosmic entertainment. Their laughter, when it came, was audible across all frequencies of reality, and drove several lesser species to immediate madness. The Void Dragon's essence, stirring in its imprisonment beneath Mars, reached out through the chaos to touch the minds of tech priests across the galaxy. Their mechanical augmentations began responding to commands that came from no human source, turning sacred machines into instruments of something far older and more terrible than chaos itself. On Terra, where the Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne, the psychic upheaval in the Vigilus sector created reverberations that reached across the galaxy. For the first time in 10 millennia, the master of mankind stirred visibly, his immense psychic presence responding to a crisis that threatened not just humanity, but the fundamental nature of existence itself. Astropaths across the Imperium screamed in unison as visions of possible futures flooded their minds. They saw realities where the laws of physics had been completely rewritten, where time flowed in circles, where the distinction between life and death had lost all meaning. In some visions, the galaxy was consumed by eternal war that existed outside the flow of time. In others, reality itself collapsed under the weight of competing impossibilities. Lord Commander Guilliman, coordinating Imperial forces from his command ship, realized that conventional tactics had become meaningless. "We are not fighting for territory or resources," he told his assembled commanders through communication channels that somehow reached across temporal barriers. "We are fighting for the right of reality to continue existing. Every moment we delay, every hesitation in our response, makes the ultimate outcome more uncertain." Yet even as he spoke, Guilliman could see that the situation was spiraling beyond any possible control. The convergence of so many reality-warping forces was creating a cascade failure in the fundamental structure of space-time. Each faction's secret weapons were not just fighting against their intended enemies, but against the very fabric of existence. The Inari death magic was raising warriors who had died in battles that hadn't happened yet. Chaos Daemon engines were possessing vehicles that existed in multiple timelines. Tyrannid bioforms were evolving in real time to adapt to threats that changed faster than evolution could account for. Toe technology was creating AI systems that achieved consciousness and immediately went insane from comprehending the impossibility of their existence. Space Marines found themselves fighting alongside enemies they had killed hours earlier, while their own fallen battle brothers rose to fight against them with weapons that fired ammunition from parallel dimensions. The distinction between ally and enemy became meaningless when temporal distortions meant that today's friend might be tomorrow's foe, or yesterday's victim might become today's executioner. In the deepest reaches of the conflict zone, where the most powerful representatives of each faction struggled for supremacy, reality had become so unstable that cause and effect no longer followed logical sequence. Battles ended before they began, while weapons fired by the defeated somehow struck down their victorious enemies. The Vigilus sector had become a wound in reality itself, a place where the impossible was not just possible, but inevitable. Every faction's most terrible secrets had been revealed, their most powerful weapons deployed, their greatest champions committed to battle. Yet instead of achieving decisive victory, they had created something that threatened to consume not just their enemies, but existence itself. The convergence of nightmares had begun, and reality itself was starting to break under the strain. In the grim darkness of the far future, even the laws of physics were no longer safe from the horror of absolute war. The galaxy had wanted to see what would happen if every faction unleashed their most terrifying secret armies simultaneously. Now it was discovering that some questions should never be answered, because the truth was more terrible than any lie. In the wake of the convergence, as reality slowly began to reassert its hold on the shattered remains of the Vigilus sector, the true cost of unleashing such terrible forces became horrifyingly clear. Victory had been achieved by no one, yet defeat was being suffered by all. The secret armies that each faction had deployed with such confidence were revealing their greatest weakness. They were too powerful for even their creators to control. On the golden flagship of the Adeptus Custodes, where Captain General Valoris had watched his 10,000 march to war with righteous pride, the first signs of corruption appeared not as external contamination, but as something far more insidious. Shield Captain Aquilus stood before his assembled guard company, his aureate armor still gleaming with the Emperor's light. Yet something fundamental had changed in his bearing. "Brothers," he spoke, his voice carrying the same authority it had for centuries, "we have witnessed things that should not exist. We have fought enemies whose very presence defies the natural order. And in doing so, we have been changed." The change was subtle at first, visible only to those who had served alongside the custodians for decades. Their movements, once precise beyond mortal comprehension, carried new hesitations. Their eyes, which had always burned with unwavering faith, now held depths that seemed to reflect experiences that belonged in no righteous soul. Most disturbing of all, some had begun to question not just their orders, but the very foundations of their purpose. Sister of Battle Canoness, Viridian, fighting alongside the Golden Warriors, recognized the signs because she had seen them in her own ranks. "The corruption does not come through contact with chaos," she reported to her superiors through encrypted Vox channels. "It comes through understanding. They have seen too much of what lies beyond the Emperor's light, and that knowledge is eating them alive from within." The custodians had been created to stand guard against the ultimate threats to humanity, but they had never been meant to confront cosmic horror on the scale they had witnessed in the convergence. Their perfect genetic engineering and psychological conditioning had protected them against conventional corruption, but exposure to the fundamental breakdown of reality itself had introduced cracks in their mental armor that no amount of gene crafting could repair. Across the galaxy, the Grey Knights faced an even more devastating revelation. Brother Captain Stern stood in the ruins of a monastery that had once housed a full company of the Emperor's demon hunters, his nemesis force sword crackling with psychic energy that no longer felt entirely clean. Around him lay the bodies of his battle brothers, not fallen to enemy action, but to something far worse. They sought to purify a demon that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, he reported to Grand Master Voldus, his voice carrying the weight of impossible choices. When they succeeded in banishing it from our reality, they created a psychic vacuum that pulled their own souls into the void it left behind. The Grey Knights had always walked the narrow path between salvation and damnation, using their psychic abilities to fight forces that could corrupt lesser minds with their mere presence. Yet the cosmic chaos of the convergence had created enemies that transcended the simple binary of corruption and purity. How could one banish a demon that existed in the past, present and future simultaneously? How could one purify corruption that had become fundamental to the structure of local reality? On distant tomb worlds, where the Necron dynasties struggled to maintain order among their awakening legions, the Flayer virus had evolved beyond its original parameters. What had begun as a curse that drove individual Necrons to madness had become something that infected entire command hierarchies. Overlord Trezin the Infinite watched in horror as his most trusted Lichguard began to exhibit the telltale signs of the virus, their perfect metal forms developing crude modifications designed for flaying flesh. "My lord," spoke Cryptek Illuminor Seras, his voice distorted by vocal synthesizers that had been damaged in recent battles. "The virus appears to have developed a form of artificial intelligence. It is not simply driving our warriors mad. It is learning from each infection, becoming more sophisticated in its methods." The implications were staggering. The flayed ones were no longer random madness given form, but a coordinated infection that sought to transform the entire Necron race into instruments of its hunger. Worse still, some of the virus-infected Necrons retained their intelligence and strategic capabilities while gaining an insatiable desire to experience organic sensation through the consumption of living flesh. Nemesis Anrakaya discovered the true scope of the crisis when his own dynasty began to turn against itself. Warriors he had awakened personally, immortals who had served his house for 60 million years, began hunting their own kind with the systematic efficiency that had once made the Necrons the galaxy's dominant species. The virus was not just spreading randomly, it was targeting the most strategically valuable individuals within each dynasty. In the bioships of Hive Fleet Leviathan, where the Hive Mind's will had always been absolute and unquestionable, something unprecedented was occurring. Bioforms that had been designed for specific battlefield roles were evolving beyond their intended parameters, developing capabilities that served no purpose in the greater swarm's strategy. The Swarm Lord itself, the ultimate expression of Tyranid strategic intelligence, found its connection to the greater hive mind growing increasingly unstable. The psychic feedback from the convergence had introduced elements into its consciousness that belonged to no Tyranid strain. When it attempted to coordinate swarm tactics, its orders were sometimes influenced by strategic thinking patterns that resembled those of its enemies. The swarm grows confused, it managed to communicate through bioform interpreters to Magus Korath, who had somehow survived the revelation of his Genestealer cult's true nature. We consume. We adapt. But we adapt to consume things that make us other than we were. Some bioforms had begun exhibiting behaviors that served no evolutionary advantage. Carnifexes were found constructing crude sculptures from the bones of their prey. Genestealers were establishing cults devoted not to preparing worlds for consumption, but to preserving organic life in forms that the hive mind found aesthetically pleasing. Most disturbing of all, some Tyranid organisms had begun to refuse sustenance, choosing starvation over consumption in a rejection of their most fundamental drive. The Eldari discovered that their desperate gambit with death magic had opened doors that could not be closed. Ivrain, prophet of Inead, stood before assemblies of returned warriors and realized that the souls she had called back from death carried with them knowledge of what lay beyond the mortal realm. That knowledge was spreading through the living Eldari like a plague of unwanted enlightenment. "We sought to cheat death," she spoke to the assembled Inari, her voice carrying harmonics that belonged to no living throat. "But death has cheated us in return," The souls we call back bring with them pieces of the realm beyond. And those pieces are changing us into something that is neither living nor dead. The returned warriors fought with unprecedented skill and fearlessness, but their presence among the living created a psychic resonance that began to attract the attention of entities that fed on the boundary between life and death. Craftworld Ulthwé reported that their infinity circuits, the soul stones that preserved Eldari consciousness after death, were beginning to discharge their stored souls without authorization. Farseer Eldrad Ulthran attempted to study the phenomenon, but discovered that his prophetic abilities were being corrupted by contact with futures that belonged to the dead rather than the living. His visions showed him possible outcomes, where the distinction between existence and extinction had lost all meaning, where the Eldari achieved immortality by ceasing to exist in any comprehensible form. Across TOE space, the mind control technologies that had seemed so efficient during their initial deployment were revealing fatal flaws. Commander Shadowsun received reports from across the Empire describing populations that had been successfully converted to the greater good, beginning to exhibit collective behaviors that defied TOE understanding. On the world of Kelshan, where human auxiliaries had been integrated into TOE society for generations, the Gwevesa suddenly began acting in perfect unison, without any coordination from ethereal command. They moved as a single organism, their individual personalities subsumed into a collective consciousness that served the greater good with such perfect efficiency that it bordered on the supernatural. "They are no longer human," reported Watercast Porel Mayen, her voice carrying the flat affect of someone struggling to process impossible information. "They are not TOE. They are something else entirely. Something that claims to serve the greater good while interpreting it in ways that our philosophy never intended." The converted populations had become too perfectly loyal, their devotion to TOE ideals transcending any rational understanding of what those ideals actually meant. They began implementing policies that maximized harmony and cooperation through methods that horrified even the ethereals who had originally programmed them. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that the conversion process was reversing itself in some populations. Humans who had been successfully integrated into TOE society for decades suddenly remembered their original lives and identities, but they retained their programmed loyalty to the greater good, creating psychological contradictions that drove entire communities to madness. In the expanding zones of Orc-controlled space, where reality had been warped to accommodate Orc logic, the consequences of unlimited energy were becoming apparent even to the greenskins themselves. War boss Gazkul Thraka stood atop his mobile fortress and watched as portions of his army began to exhibit behaviors that violated even Orc understanding of how things should work. Some Orc vehicles had become so convinced of their own speed that they existed in a state of perpetual motion, unable to stop even when their crews wanted to dismount. Weapons that had been designed to be loud and destructive had become so loud that they created sound-based reality distortions, causing nearby objects to behave according to acoustic rather than physical laws. "Dis ain't right," complained Big Mech Scarjaw, his voice carrying across battlefield communications through methods that involved shouting very loudly at the universe until it listened. "De boys is getting too good at believing. De's startin' to believe in things that even Orcs shouldn't believe in." The problem was that Orc reality warping had no built-in limitations. If enough Orcs believed something strongly enough, it became real, regardless of whether it made sense, even by Orc standards. Some war bosses had become so convinced of their own invincibility that they had stopped eating, sleeping, or performing any maintenance on their equipment, expecting the universe to take care of such details automatically. Zones of space, where Orc fleets had passed, began to exhibit persistent changes to physical law that affected non-Orc species as well. Imperial Navy vessels found their engines operating according to Orc logic, gaining speed by being painted red regardless of their actual mechanical condition. Chaos forces discovered that their demon engines were becoming louder and more aggressive simply through proximity to areas where Orcs believed that all proper weapons should make lots of noise. Lord Commander Gilliman, observing the reports streaming in from across the galaxy, recognized the full scope of the catastrophe they had unleashed. "We sought to end the crisis by deploying our ultimate weapons," he told his assembled staff, his expression carrying the weight of choices whose consequences would echo across centuries. "Instead, we have learned that some weapons are too dangerous to use, not because of what they do to our enemies, but because of what they do to ourselves." The secret armies that had been meant to preserve each faction's survival were consuming their creators from within. Victory had become indistinguishable from defeat when the tools of triumph carried within them the seeds of their wielders' destruction. Across the galaxy, the price of unleashing such terrible forces was being paid not in the currency of defeat, but in the far more precious coin of identity itself. Each faction was discovering that their ultimate weapons demanded a cost that victory could never justify. The terror they had sought to inflict upon their enemies had turned inward, and now they faced the horrifying prospect of being destroyed not by alien foes, but by the very forces they had created to ensure their survival. In the years that followed the convergence, as the galaxy slowly settled into patterns that bore little resemblance to the order that had existed before, a new kind of equilibrium emerged from the ashes of the old certainties. The great rift, which had torn the galaxy apart, finally stabilized into a permanent scar across the stars. But the space around it remained forever changed, marked by distortions that reminded all who looked upon them that reality itself had been wounded. The age of secret armies had ended, not through victory or defeat, but through revelation. What had once been hidden now walked openly beneath alien suns, their terrible nature no longer a carefully guarded secret, but a simple fact of existence. On Imperial worlds, populations that had once lived in ignorance of the galaxy's true horrors now went about their daily lives under the watchful gaze of custodian patrols and Grey Knight battle companies. On Terra, where the Golden Throne had stood in silence for 10 millennia, something fundamental had changed in the master of mankind's presence. The Emperor had stirred, not to consciousness, but to a deeper level of awareness that rippled through the Imperium like tremors before an earthquake. Tech priests who tended the life support systems reported fluctuations in the psychic resonance fields that had remained stable since the time of Horus. "His dreams are different," reported High Techmarinus Clavan to the assembled High Lords, his voice carrying the weight of observations that bordered on heresy. The patterns that emerge from his neural activity suggest anticipation, as if he is preparing for something that we cannot yet comprehend. The changes were subtle, but unmistakable to those with the knowledge to interpret them. The Astronomicon, which had guided human ships through the warp for 10,000 years, began to pulse with new frequencies that contained information beyond mere navigation. Astropaths across the galaxy reported receiving fragmentary visions of possible futures, glimpses of a time when humanity would face a choice that would define its destiny for all eternity. Yet even as the Emperor stirred in response to the cosmic crisis, the galaxy itself was adapting to the permanent presence of forces that should never have been unleashed. Imperial citizens who had once fled in terror at the sight of Xenos now lived alongside them in uneasy truces born of necessity. On the hive world of Necromunda, Gangers who had fought each other for generations found themselves cooperating against genestealer cults whose hybrid nature made them enemies of all purely human factions. Commander Shadowson, leading TOW forces that now included Eldari Rangers and human auxiliaries who retained their original memories while serving the greater good, stood atop the observation deck of her command ship and watched as reality slowly healed around the worst of the damage. The convergence had taught all the galaxy's species that their individual survival depended upon finding ways to coexist with threats that transcended any single faction's ability to comprehend. "The galaxy has become smaller," she observed to her mixed species command staff, her words translated through devices that had learned to accommodate the psychological as well as linguistic differences between species. "We can no longer afford the luxury of total warfare when the alternative is universal extinction. The alliances that formed in the aftermath of the convergence would have been unthinkable in earlier ages. Space Marine chapters found themselves fighting alongside Necron dynasties against tyrannid swarms that had evolved beyond their original parameters. Orc war bosses discovered that their reality-warping abilities could be used to repair damage caused by chaos incursions, leading to the unprecedented sight of greenskins working to restore rather than destroy Imperial infrastructure. Most surprising of all was the cooperation between Imperial and Chaos forces when faced with threats that transcended their ideological differences. On the demon world of Sortiarius, where Magnus the Red had long plotted his revenge against the Imperium, Grey Knights and Thousand Sun sorcerers worked side by side to contain a breach in reality that threatened to consume both the material universe and the warp itself. "We are no longer enemies in the traditional sense," Magnus explained to Grandmaster Voldus during one of their coordination meetings, his massive form flickering between states of existence as his consciousness operated across multiple dimensional layers. "We are survivors of a cosmic catastrophe, working together to prevent an even greater one." The Eldari, whose various factions had spent millennia locked in bitter rivalry, found themselves united by the simple necessity of survival. Craftworld Ulthway's seers worked openly with Drukhari Archons and Harlequin troop masters to monitor the psychic disturbances that continued to ripple across the galaxy. Their combined knowledge, pooled for the first time since the fall, revealed patterns in the cosmic damage that suggested the possibility of eventual healing. "Death and birth are part of the same cycle," Ivrain observed during a gathering of Eldari leaders that would have been impossible in any earlier age. "Perhaps what we have witnessed is not the end of the old galaxy, but the beginning of something entirely new." Yet the price of adaptation had been steep beyond calculation. Entire sectors remained uninhabitable, their local physics so damaged by the reality storms that followed the convergence that normal matter could not exist within their boundaries. These zones of absolute chaos served as reminders of what happened when forces beyond mortal comprehension were allowed to operate without restraint. The Imperium itself had been transformed beyond recognition. Lord Commander Guilliman, now ruling not just the southern regions of the galaxy, but serving as coordinator for a vast network of allied species, presided over an empire that bore only superficial resemblance to the realm his father had built. Imperial doctrine had been revised to accommodate the reality of permanent supernatural threats, while the ecclesiarchy struggled to develop theologies that could account for the continued existence of entities that challenged every fundamental assumption about the nature of reality. "We have learned humility," Guilliman reflected, during one of his regular communications with the scattered Primarchs who had begun to return in response to the cosmic crisis. "Humanity is not the galaxy's dominant species. We are simply one of many survivors, all struggling to comprehend forces that transcend our individual understanding. The Tyranid hive fleets, their behavior patterns permanently altered by their exposure to competing forms of consciousness, had begun to exhibit something that resembled curiosity rather than simple hunger. They consumed worlds not for biomass, but for the experiences contained within the minds of their inhabitants, creating vast libraries of consciousness that served purposes no human strategist could fathom. The Necron dynasties, fractured by the spread of the Flayer virus, had learned to accommodate the madness within their ranks rather than fight it. Destroyer cults operated alongside conventional forces, their nihilistic philosophy channeled into constructive purposes by overlords who had discovered that controlled madness could be more effective than rigid sanity when dealing with enemies that operated according to impossible logic. Even the Orc Empire, which should have benefited most from the reality-warping chaos, found itself constrained by the need to maintain some semblance of universal law. Gazakul Thraka, now elevated to beast status through the accumulated belief of billions of green skins, discovered that absolute power over reality came with responsibilities he had never anticipated. "Turns out," he explained to his assembled war bosses during a gathering that was part military planning session and part theological debate, "when you can make anything happen, you gotta be careful what you wants to happen. Otherwise, everything gets too weird, even for orcs." The populations of countless worlds had adapted to living with constant supernatural terror in ways that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. Children grew up learning to distinguish between different types of reality distortions. Citizens developed instinctive responses to psychic phenomena that allowed them to maintain some semblance of normal life, even when the fundamental laws of physics fluctuated around them. On planets where time flowed in circles, communities learned to live with the knowledge that they might encounter their own past or future selves at any moment. In systems where warp energy had permanently altered local physics, people developed new forms of mathematics that could account for arithmetic that changed based on the emotional state of the calculator. Most remarkably, a new form of hope had emerged from the nightmare. Not the bright optimism of earlier ages, but a grim determination born of the understanding that survival itself was a form of victory. Humans, Eldari, Toh, and even the more rational Orc tribes began to develop shared cultural institutions that transcended species boundaries. Universities that taught the principles of multidimensional physics operated alongside monasteries that preserved the religious traditions of a dozen different species. Trade routes that had been established to share military intelligence evolved into cultural exchange networks that allowed ideas to flow between civilizations that had previously considered each other irredeemably alien. The galaxy that emerged from the convergence was not the ordered realm that any faction had originally sought to create. It was stranger, more dangerous, and infinitely more complex than the universe that had existed before. Yet it was also more resilient, because its inhabitants had learned to adapt to impossibility rather than being destroyed by it. In the deepest vaults of Terra, where the most ancient records of humanity were preserved, scholars began to compile new histories that attempted to document what had happened when every faction had unleashed their most terrible secrets simultaneously. They wrote of the age when reality itself had been wounded and healed into new configurations, when the impossible had become commonplace, and when survival had required not just courage, but the willingness to abandon every comfortable certainty about the nature of existence. The Emperor continued to stir upon the Golden Throne, his vast consciousness processing the implications of the cosmic transformation that his children had both caused and survived. The dreams that emanated from his eternal vigil spoke of futures where humanity would face even greater challenges. but also of possibilities where the species that had learned to survive the unleashing of ultimate terrors might find ways to transcend them entirely. The galaxy had been transformed by the revelation of its deepest secrets, scarred by the convergence of its most terrible weapons, and forever changed by the knowledge that some powers were too dangerous to use, but too necessary to abandon. In the grim darkness of the far future, terror had become the only constant, but it was a terror that had taught its victims how to endure the unendurable. The age of hidden warfare was over. The age of open nightmare had begun, and in that nightmare, against all expectation and logic, something that might eventually be called hope continued to survive. Whether that hope would prove sufficient for the challenges that lay ahead remained to be seen. But for the first time in 10,000 years, the galaxy's inhabitants faced their uncertain future together, united not by ideology or species loyalty, but by the shared experience of having survived the impossible and learned to call it home.